Hello, how are you? Here I will help you sleep with a crime story that has happened with the sound of comfortable rain. Of course, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to this channel for the good of all of us. Let's get started. Story 1. In 2014, I was living in Bangkok, Thailand, working part-time as a consultant for an international shipping company. My specialty was helping galleries and private collectors move valuable artworks discreetly and securely across borders. Most of my work was legitimate, but in Asia, you quickly learn that valuable cargo always attracts dangerous attention. That summer, I was contacted by a small private gallery in Ceylon. They wanted me to oversee the packing and transport of a set of paintings by a well-known Southeast Asian modernist, worth about $3 million in total. The pieces were scheduled to be shipped to Singapore for a private auction. When I arrived at the gallery for the first inspection, I immediately noticed something strange. 2 security guards were missing, and the CCTV system wasn't working. The owner brushed it off, saying they were upgrading their equipment. I wrote it in my notes but didn't think much of it. That was my first mistake. 2 weeks later, the night before shipment, I went back to supervise final crating. The paintings were laid out in the storage room, waiting for me to sign off. I had just finished sealing the first crate when the gallery lights flickered, and the building suddenly went dark. I assumed it was a power surge, common in Bangkok during storms, but within seconds, I heard the sound of a door being forced open downstairs. 3 men in black masks stormed in, moving with precision like they had done this before. One of them pointed a pistol at me, telling me in Thai to stay on the floor and not look up. I didn't argue. I kept my head down and hands out. They knew exactly where to go. Within 5 minutes, the paintings were removed from their crates, rolled expertly, and stuffed into tubes they had brought with them. Before leaving, one of the men crouched next to me and whispered in English, "You never saw us. You never heard us. Sign the paperwork like everything was normal." Then they vanished into the storm outside. When the owner arrived the next morning, we opened the crates and found nothing but empty frames. The auction was cancelled, and police swarmed the gallery. I gave my statement, but I could tell from their questions that they suspected an inside job. How else could the thieves have known the schedule, the exact layout of the storage room, and the lack of security that night? Weeks of investigation followed. CCTV footage from the street showed the getaway van, but the plates were fake. Interpol got involved, as the paintings were likely already smuggled out of Thailand through Cambodia or Malaysia. The gallery owner lost everything. I wasn't charged, but my name stayed in the police report as a key witness. To this day, those paintings have never resurfaced. Experts believe they were sold privately to collectors who don't care about provenance, only possession. And I still take art transport contracts sometimes, but I always insist on double security, live tracking, and full background checks on everyone involved. Because that night in Bangkok taught me a truth I'll never forget. The most valuable art doesn't always hang in museums. It often hangs in shadows, guarded by people who will do anything to keep it hidden. Next story. Washington Township, Michigan in 2009. A place where families lived behind white picket fences and crime was the last thing on anyone's mind. But behind closed doors, one household was hiding secrets that would soon come to light in the most horrific way. Tara Lynn Grant was born in 1972 and grew up in the small town of Perkins in Michigan's Upper Peninsula. Known for her bright smile, sharp mind, and strong work ethic, she rose from a modest upbringing on a hobby farm to walk the halls of Michigan State University. It was there, during her university years, that she met Stephen Grant, the man who would later become her husband. They seemed like the perfect match. Young, ambitious, and in love. After graduating in 1994, began building a successful career in business while Stephen worked closer to home. The couple eventually settled in Washington Township, started a family, and on the surface appeared to be living the American dream. In the early days of their relationship, Tara was focused on a future in economics while Stephen leaned more towards politics, something Tara actually found impressive. But even before they officially became a couple, Stephen did something that left a lasting impression on her. When Tara's grandfather passed away, she returned home for the funeral, only to discover, on the day of the service, that Stephen had traveled hundreds of miles just to be there and comfort her. Tara hadn't expected this, and she was genuinely touched when she saw him. It meant a great deal that he cared for her so deeply, and she realized he must truly have feelings for her to go to such lengths. From that moment on, the two began seeing each other regularly, and soon moved in together. At first, they shared a flat with others, occupying just one room of their own. After finishing their degrees, they relocated to Detroit, Stephen's hometown. Stephen's father owned a business there, a shop that specialized in metal cutting and forming equipment. He offered Stephen a job, along with a decent salary, and Stephen accepted, glad to start working immediately after the move, while also keeping an eye out for other opportunities. Tara, too, started working at a company in Detroit. Although everything was new to her, her diligence and talent were quickly recognized. She was given more responsibilities and entrusted with important tasks. Driven and ambitious, Tara threw herself into her work. She avoided taking time off unless absolutely necessary. Even when the couple welcomed their first child, a daughter named Lindsay, in 2000, Tara returned to work as soon as she could. Stephen stayed home to care for their baby, while she focused on her career. The same thing happened when, 2 years later, Tara gave birth to their son, Ian. Again, she resumed work quickly, and Stephen took on the role of full-time parent. He handled all the domestic duties, and when comparing their incomes, the decision made financial sense. Stephen earned a decent wage at his father's company, but Tara, who had already been promoted several times, was earning significantly more. Had she stayed at home, their financial situation would have suffered. Stephen, to his credit, didn't seem to mind. He enjoyed looking after the children and managing the home. He didn't see anything wrong with reversing traditional gender roles. While he spent most of his time running the household, he still went into his father's workshop when Tara was home on weekends. And during those brief windows, she would look after the children she adored. For several years, this arrangement worked. Tara continued to climb the corporate ladder, eventually being offered a major promotion, a managerial role overseeing a company branch in Puerto Rico. The job came with a significant pay increase, a salary of $168,000 per year. At the time, Stephen was earning around $18,000 annually. In fact, Tara's end-of-year bonuses were larger than her husband's entire yearly income. However, the promotion meant frequent travel. At first, she only left home for a few days at a time, but over time she needed to be away nearly the entire week, flying out on Mondays or Tuesdays and returning on Fridays. She was home only on weekends, meaning that Stephen now had full responsibility for everything during the week. What had once been a shared effort became a one-man operation. Eventually, Stephen decided it was too much for one person to handle. He suggested hiring a nanny to help with the children. Tara agreed. She didn't want him to be overwhelmed, and if they had extra help, Stephen could return to work at his father's shop more often. They chose to hire an au pair, a young woman from abroad, typically staying with a host family for a year in exchange for room, board, and a small stipend. They knew the candidate might not speak fluent English, but she would likely bring a second language into the home, giving the children the opportunity to learn, and all at a lower cost than daycare. From 2003 onward, a series of au pairs came and went. Some left of their own accord after just weeks or months. Others were dismissed for not meeting expectations. Eventually, a 19-year-old from Germany named Verena Durkes joined the household. Like the others before her, Verena had been selected by Stephen, something that made perfect sense to Tara. He would be spending more time with her during the week, and she needed to be someone he could get along with. Tara herself was home only on weekends, and wouldn't have the same level of contact with the young woman. But Tara's frequent absence from home did not mean she was uninterested in her children. Quite the opposite. Whenever she was home, she devoted all her time to them, playing with them or taking them out for walks. She often left little notes around the house with messages for the children to find while she was away. Tara also made an effort to maintain her marriage. It was well known that such a relationship, where one partner was away most of the time, wasn't easy. And so, in mid-February 2007, Tara planned a short trip with her husband to a place located on the other side of the country. There were many vineyards in the area, and one of the main attractions of the trip was meant to be wine tasting, a surprise for Stephen. She knew he would be happy. In fact, the entire trip was intended as a surprise for him. His birthday was coming up, and Tara wanted to make it special. It was meant to be a chance for them to spend some quality time together, just the two of them, But everything turned out completely differently from what the 34-year-old had planned. On the 14th of February, Valentine's Day, Stephen turned up at the police station to report his wife missing. He said he had last seen her several days earlier, on Friday, February 9th. That evening, at around 10:30 p.m., Tara returned home after being away all week, just as she always did on Fridays. Stephen had assumed she would stay with the family for the weekend as usual. But when she phoned him from the airport to say her flight had been delayed, she also told him she would have to return to Puerto Rico on Sunday. That news led to a row between the couple. Stephen had grown tired of the arrangement. His wife was barely ever at home. The children and he himself missed her terribly and looked forward to her return. But now it seemed she would be leaving again far sooner than expected. When Tara got home, they argued for about 20 minutes. Then she decided to leave the house immediately and fly back to Puerto Rico the very next day. She called someone to collect her, packed her suitcase, and simply left. Stephen watched as she got into a car, what looked like the same dark taxi that picked her up each week to take her to the airport. He hoped she might cool off and come back home, but she never did. Not only did Tara not return, she also didn't make any contact. She didn't answer her phone when Stephen called. And each time he tried to reach her, the call went straight to voicemail. He left several messages asking her to come home, but there was no response. After the weekend, Stephen contacted Tara's family to ask whether she might be with them. He had already spoken to her boss and found out that she hadn't returned to Puerto Rico on Saturday. She hadn't shown up on Sunday either, nor on Monday. But neither her sister nor her mother knew where she might be. They knew Tara well, and were confident she just needed some time after the argument before reaching out. They were sure nothing bad had happened to her, and told Stephen to wait a little longer before going to the police. However, when 5 days had passed and there was still no word from her, no call, no message, no sign, Stephen finally went to the police on the 14th of February. As is often the case in such situations, he immediately became the first suspect. Still, he cooperated fully with investigators and agreed to everything they asked of him. When they requested a polygraph test, he consented without hesitation. But the following day, instead of attending the test, his lawyer phoned the police to inform them that his client would no longer be participating. Of course, Stephen was within his rights to refuse, but in the eyes of the police, that kind of behavior always raised suspicions. The investigation into Tara's disappearance got underway. The first steps included checking her bank transactions and phone records. It turned out that she hadn't used her bank card since the 9th of February. The last transaction she made was paying for airport parking. Normally, she used her card regularly, but in the days since her disappearance, there had been no activity at all. Tara also hadn't made any phone calls since the night she was last seen. Before that, she frequently rang her mother and sister, and often used her phone for work calls. But after February 9th, her mobile hadn't been used even once. That pointed to one of two possibilities. Either something had happened to her, or she had chosen to disappear and cut all ties with her previous life. But why would she do that? She had a fulfilling job she loved, a husband and 2 children she adored. Everyone who knew her believed she would never abandon her children. Nor would she quit her job without informing someone first. She had been an extremely loyal employee, and in 10 years of working for the company had never taken a single sick day. For that reason, the second scenario that she had chosen to vanish seemed highly unlikely, which meant only one thing. Something must have happened to her. But what? Had she been kidnapped? Would there soon be a ransom demand? Or was it already too late? It was hard to imagine who would want Tara dead. Investigators focused on the taxi companies, hoping to trace where she went that night. But after contacting every local firm, they found that none of them had picked up a fare from the Grant home. Yet Stephen was certain he had seen his wife leave in a dark vehicle. He assumed it was a taxi. But what if it had been a private car? As the investigation progressed, detectives began to suspect that Stephen might not be telling them the whole truth. More and more evidence pointed to the likelihood that there had been no car at all. Tara had not checked into any hotel in town, not near the airport, and not anywhere else. Furthermore, a check of her phone records confirmed that she hadn't made any calls after returning home. The last call made from her mobile had been to her husband during the drive home from the airport, at exactly 9:47 p.m. After that, Tara made no further calls from her mobile phone, nor did anyone use the landline at the house, but her husband testified that he had heard her speaking with someone before she left. It was also certain that Tara had not boarded any flight, neither to Puerto Rico, nor to any other country or city in the United States. The story Stephen had presented was beginning to appear less and less credible. It seemed increasingly likely that he had lied to the police, a suspicion further reinforced by her boss, who denied that Tara had been scheduled to return to work earlier than usual. According to what he had confirmed, she was expected back at work on Monday as always. She had no plans that would have required her to come home early. There was no reason for her to leave the house on Sunday, as her husband had suggested. Tara's sister told the police exactly the same thing. They had spoken on the phone on the February 9th, during which Tara had shared her plans for the weekend. She had definitely mentioned that she would be flying back to Puerto Rico on Monday. Everything uncovered during the investigation was beginning to cast suspicion on Stephen. Yet at that stage, detectives had no evidence directly linking him to Tara's disappearance. Her whereabouts remained unknown. The authorities appealed to the public for help. In a plea addressed to anyone who might know anything about Tara's disappearance, Stephen and the police asked the public to come forward with any information. Numerous tips were received from people who claimed to have seen Tara in various locations, but none of these sightings could be confirmed. Her whereabouts remained a mystery. Aside from one press conference he had attended alongside the detectives, Stephen organized several more on his own, often appearing with his lawyer. He insisted he was doing everything possible to find his wife. He claimed to miss her deeply and said he was worried something terrible might have happened, but above all he said he was doing it for the sake of his children. At the time of Tara's disappearance, the children were just 6 and 4 years old, still very young and sorely missing their mother. During these press conferences, Stephen appeared visibly emotional, his voice trembled, and he often struggled to hold back tears. These appearances were clearly difficult for him. The press conferences had not been organized by the police, but detectives monitored them closely. They paid careful attention to everything Tara's husband said and found themselves with the growing impression that he was hiding something. They noted how he spoke about his wife. With each new appearance, he painted her in an increasingly negative light, as if trying to convince the public that Tara had not been an ideal wife or mother, and that he, by contrast, had been a devoted husband and father. He expressed resentment over Tara's frequent business trips, claiming that she treated him like a valet, and was a bad mother who didn't spend enough time with their children. Stephen stated, "I was a better mom than Tara was. There's no other way to put it. I was the mom in the house. She was gone all the time." He also suggested that Tara never attended their children's activities, contradicting statements from her family, who insisted she made every effort to be present. Investigators also noticed that each time Stephen visited the police station, he would stop by the petrol station across the street on his way out. Curious about this habit, they discovered that he was purchasing every local newspaper available, seemingly to check what had already been reported about the case. Detectives continued to reflect on this behavior until, 2 weeks after Tara's disappearance, someone came forward with potentially vital information. It was Stephen's former partner, someone he had recently reconnected with shortly before Tara went missing. They had been exchanging emails, and it quickly became clear that Stephen was trying to arrange a meeting. That would likely lead to a romantic encounter. When the woman reminded him that he was married, Stephen reportedly said that he treated his marriage vows like speed limits. "You know they're there, but sometimes you just have to break them." He added that his wife wasn't exactly a saint either, claiming to suspect she was having an affair with her boss. However, detectives were unable to confirm any such affair. No evidence was found that Tara had been unfaithful, and her boss categorically denied any involvement. But reading those emails gave investigators a new perspective on Stephen. They began to consider whether the former partner was the only woman with whom he had tried to cheat. Throughout this time, Stephen had been living with a young, attractive woman named Verena, who worked as a nanny. Perhaps he had developed a relationship with her. Not long after Tara went missing, Verena returned to her native Germany. The agency that had helped her find work wanted no association with the case, and quickly sent the 19-year-old back home. Before she left the U.S., she was interviewed by police. She was asked whether anything romantic had happened between her and Stephen, but she denied it. Even so, detectives considered the possibility that Stephen, feeling lonely, might have grown close to the young nanny. Farina couldn't provide much information about the couple's argument or the moment Tara had left the house. She had been out at the time, meeting with friends. When she returned, was already gone. She encountered Stephen, who was visibly distressed, and he told her what had supposedly happened between him and his wife. Verena found Tara's behavior puzzling. She hadn't expected that sort of reaction from her. Tara had always seemed to enjoy spending time with her children, so why would she leave without even saying goodbye? According to Stephen, she had come home late at night when the children were already asleep, packed her things, and left immediately. The nanny also found it odd that Stephen claimed Tara had taken a taxi to the airport. He said she usually did that. But Verena knew that wasn't true. Tara almost always drove herself. She only used taxis in exceptional circumstances. Police obtained all of this information from Verena on the very day Tara's disappearance was reported, when they first visited the Grant home. Unfortunately, once she returned to Germany, detectives lost the opportunity to question her further, especially after discovering Stephen's emails to his former girlfriend. But the real breakthrough in the case came on February 28th. A woman walking through a park. 1. Stephen had frequently mentioned as a place the family loved to visit and which had already been searched, noticed a plastic bag stuffed into the hollow of a fallen tree. Inside she found a pair of rubber gloves, but what caught her attention most were the bloodstains. Aware of Tara's disappearance and knowing that the park was located near the family's home, she contacted the police. When investigators arrived at the scene, they secured the evidence and sent everything to the lab. Testing confirmed that the blood was human. Additionally, analysts discovered tiny metal shavings in the samples, so small they could only be seen under a microscope. A few strands of hair were also found in the bag. Initially, it was unclear whether the hair was human or animal, but lab results later confirmed it most likely belonged to a dog. And since the Grants owned a long-haired dog, it was suspected that the hairs might have belonged to it. As metal shavings were also found in the examined sample and Stephen worked at his father's business, he had access to various cutting machines. Investigators decided to immediately search his home. As soon as a search warrant was obtained for both his house and the shop where Stephen worked, police officers went to both locations on the 2nd of March, as Stephen had been under surveillance the entire time. They knew he wasn't at home, but after a while they realized he was returning there. And the officers had no choice but to inform him that his house and his father's shop were going to be searched. There was a slight nervousness in his behavior. He became less talkative and kept staring at a single point. He only asked if he could take the dog for a walk while the officers searched the house. And since there were no grounds to detain him, he was allowed to go. The search began, and after some time the officers entered the garage. One of them was drawn to a plastic container. It was clearly brand new. This officer had been at the house on the 14th of February when Stephen had reported his wife missing. He remembered being in that same garage and he didn't recall seeing the container there at the time. Out of curiosity, he lifted the lid and noticed something wrapped in a black plastic bag inside. He gently pressed it and realized it was something soft. Carefully they cut through the black bag, revealing another layer, clear plastic wrap. Once that was removed, the officers discovered the torso of a woman. The clothing was still on the body, and just as Stephen had earlier told investigators, it matched exactly what Tara had last been seen wearing. There was no longer any doubt whose body had been found in the garage. After more than 2 weeks of searching, they had finally discovered what had happened to Tara, and everyone now knew who was responsible for her death. But the suspect was nowhere to be found. Tara's body was discovered roughly 90 minutes after the search began, which meant the man had ample time to flee the area. Officers tried to locate him nearby, but without success. He was nowhere to be seen. A manhunt was launched. At the same time as the search at the Grants' home, Stephen's father's shop was also being examined. The place was a mess, except for one specific area. It was immediately obvious that no one had cleaned in a long time, except around one particular machine. It looked as though someone had cleaned just that spot. The officers quickly noticed metal shavings near the machine, identical to those found with the woman's body. It wasn't hard to imagine what had taken place there a few weeks earlier. Clearly, Stephen had concluded it would be easier to hide Tara's body if it wasn't in one piece. Investigators now knew that Tara was dead. A part of her body had been found. The question remained, Where was the rest? Since a bag with gloves had previously been found in the park, they decided to search the park again, this time more thoroughly than before. And once again the sniffer dogs helped locate the remaining body parts. Not all were recovered, but the vast majority were. A later autopsy determined the cause of death. Tara had been strangled, her hyoid bone was broken, and marks on her neck confirmed this. More and more was becoming clear about Tara's death, but Stephen's whereabouts remained unknown. The day after Tara's body was found, a press conference was held, during which the public was informed that Stephen was wanted in connection with his wife's murder. After the conference, several people contacted the police with information about him. He had been in touch with his lawyer, who stated that Stephen was in a very poor mental state, and that there was a real risk he might harm himself. Stephen's sister also contacted police as he had reached out to her too. On the day his home was searched, he had come to her house and left the dog with her. He also told her that he would soon be arrested. But before that happened, he intended to drive north to a nature park he and Tara had often visited together. Verena, who was still in Germany, also got in touch with investigators. She too had spoken with Stephen while he was being sought. During their conversation, not only did he declare his love for her, he also confessed to killing his wife. According to what he told her, it hadn't been planned. What happened had been an accident. During an argument, had pushed him, and Stephen had done the same in return, but he had used too much force and Tara had fallen to the floor. Must have struck her head on something, and that fall had caused her death. Because Stephen hadn't called Verena from a mobile phone, but from a landline, authorities were able to confirm that he had been in the area of the national park mentioned by his sister. Everyone who had spoken to him believed he was not sober during the calls, and with each conversation his condition seemed to worsen. In the meantime, investigators learned that he had borrowed a car from a friend, was likely using it to travel. Fairly quickly they established where the vehicle had last been seen. When they tracked the car by following its tire tracks in the snow, police finally reached the man. He was in the park, and despite the bitter cold and the snow all around, he was wearing only socks, underwear, and a shirt. His mental state left much to be desired. He was seeing things that weren't there and talking to trees. He was immediately transported to hospital as his body temperature had dropped to 30.5 degrees Celsius and he needed urgent medical care. Once Stephen's condition improved slightly, he told staff that he had taken several pills and drunk a large amount of alcohol. He had tried to end his life, and if the police hadn't found him for another few hours, he might have succeeded. When investigators were finally able to question him, Stephen confessed to everything. He was the one who had taken Tara's life. During the argument, things had turned physical, and he had struck his wife in the face. That made Tara even more furious, and she told him that their marriage was over, that she would file for divorce, and that she would take the children from him. Stephen couldn't let that happen. He had cared for the children practically since the day they were born. He had spent more time with them than his wife had, and now she wanted to take them away from him. For the past 5 months, ever since she had started working in Puerto Rico, everything had been on his shoulders. He was the one taking the children to the doctor, to extracurricular activities. He couldn't let her take them from him. He grabbed her by the neck and began to tighten his grip with all the strength he had. He only let go once he was certain that his wife was dead. In the meantime, he had covered her face with a blouse that was lying nearby. He didn't want to look at her as she died. Once Tara was no longer alive, he picked up his phone and sent a message to Verena that read, "You owe me a kiss." He wrote the exact same message on a note he left on her pillow, as if he had done it all for her, so they could be together. Then he moved Tara's body to the car, and he did so just in time because only a few minutes later Verena returned home. Stephen pretended to think it was Tara who had come back, that she had changed her mind. He tried to play the part of a worried husband. He knew that when he eventually reported his wife missing, the police would want to speak to Verena. Stephen also admitted that his relationship with the children's nanny went beyond professional boundaries. He was very attracted to her and had been trying to win her over for some time. Gradually he got closer to her, until the young woman could no longer resist him. On the very day he took his wife's life, the night with Verena in the same bed he had once shared with Tara. Tara's body remained in the boot of the car for the entire following day. On Sunday morning, he took it to his father's shop. Later he drove to a park where he scattered her remains among the trees. He had hoped animals would take care of them, but when he later heard that investigators planned to search the park, he began to panic. He feared he hadn't hidden the torso well enough in the snow. He returned to the park, retrieved the torso, and took it back with him. At first he hid it in a box at his father's shop, but he knew he couldn't leave it there forever. On March 1st he moved it to his own garage. He planned to deal with it the next day, but early that morning the police arrived at his house with a warrant to search the property. Investigators had a hard time believing everything Stephen said, especially the part about an argument between the couple. Stephen kept insisting that they had argued because Tara wanted to return to work early on Sunday. But the police had already established that Tara had no plans to return to Puerto Rico earlier than expected. If there had been an argument at all, it must have been about something else. Perhaps Stephen had simply had enough of running the household and taking care of the children. For most of the time he was alone, without his wife by his side. That may have led him to start paying more attention to other women. Sadly, the true motive was never fully established. Stephen continued to insist that the fight was about Tara's early departure. That same year in December, his trial began. Stephen maintained that he had never planned to kill Tara. What had happened, he said, was a tragic accident. Stephen Grant was sentenced to 50 to 80 years in prison for the second-degree murder of his wife, Tara Lynn Grant. In addition, he received a 6 to 10-year sentence for mutilation of a dead body. The sentences are being served concurrently, meaning he must serve at least 50 years before becoming eligible for parole. The sentencing took place on February 21, 2008, following his conviction in December 2007. During the proceedings, Macomb County Circuit Judge Diane Drzezinski described Grant's actions as demonic, manipulative, barbaric, and dishonest. The judge emphasized the severity of the crime, noting the psychological trauma inflicted on the couple's children and Grant's calculated efforts to evade detection. Throughout the entire trial and sentencing, Stephen showed no emotion. It was as if the case didn't concern him at all, as if it had nothing to do with him or anyone he loved. He remained unmoved. But what happened on the February 9th left a deep scar on the rest of his family. His children lost their mother forever, but in truth they also lost their father, who may never be released from prison. Tara's sister took custody of the children and eventually adopted them. Stephen's father also struggled to cope with what had happened to his daughter-in-law. Aware of what had taken place in his shop, he took his own life 6 months after Tara's murder. Stephen Grant's appeals were ultimately unsuccessful. In March 2010, the Michigan Supreme Court upheld his conviction and sentence, rejecting claims that pretrial publicity had compromised the fairness of the trial or that his confession had been improperly obtained. As of now, Grant remains incarcerated in Michigan. Tara Lynn Grant was more than just a name in the headlines or a figure in a courtroom. She was a daughter, a sister, a mother of 2 young children, and a woman with a bright future ahead of her. Her dedication to her career never diminished the love she had for her family. Those who knew her remember her warmth, her energy, and her relentless drive. Her life was taken far too soon by someone who should have protected her. But by telling her story, we honor her memory and shine a light on the hidden dangers that can exist behind closed doors. Story 2. The parched dawn of June 1919, the heart of equatorial Africa pulsed with silence so deep that even the hyenas seemed hushed, wary of something amiss in the wind. The village of Mbamba, nestled beside the sluggish Oyo River beneath the great baobab trees, had survived droughts, colonial taxation raids, and the influenza that had swept inland from the ports. Yet nothing prepared its people for what would come. Not fire, nor plague, nor invasion, but a hidden fracture deep in the land itself. For centuries, whispers spoke of spirits trapped beneath Mount Gweliol, a dormant volcanic spine cloaked in rainforest and forgotten by maps. Elders warned that the earth there had a mouth, but in the decades of European expeditions and rubber harvesting, such tales were dismissed as tribal myth. The colonizers who oversaw the concession companies focused on quotas and extraction, uninterested in the moody restlessness of the soil. But on that morning, as the first cracks split the forest floor and a trembling passed through the termite hills and maize fields like a shiver from a dreaming giant, the truth of those whispers surged into reality. The land had begun to breathe. Again, and it would exhale in fury. Bomba's headman, Kamu and Ioka, awoke to the terrified braying of goats and the sudden silence of birds. The morning mist, usually thick and lazy, hung strangely still, unnaturally still, as though the air itself had forgotten to move. He stepped outside his hut, his weathered fingers clutching his staff, and felt the earth rumble faintly beneath his feet like a growl. Children screamed from across the riverbank, and mothers clutched them close, their eyes darting skyward where smoke now curled above the trees. The jungle had caught fire before, during dry seasons and lightning storms, but this smoke did not rise in billowing plumes. It slithered like a snake, black, low and angry, pouring from the old volcano's cracked face. It brought with it a stench of sulfur and rot, a breath from the underworld, thick enough to make men gag and eyes weep. Combs shouted for the drummers. The warning rhythm began, low, fast, urgent, summoning those who could run and warning those who could not. But even as the village mobilized, a fissure opened beneath the elder's grove. The baobab roots groaned, split, and were swallowed whole by the gaping wound of the earth. Far beyond Mbamba, missionaries stationed along the Oyo River basin also felt the tremors, though they misread them at first. Sister Miriam of the Dutch Reformed Mission wrote in her journal, "The furniture shook and the chapel's bell rang though no one had touched it. We thought it an aftershock from the Great War, perhaps some delayed echo from the shells of Flanders reaching even here. But it was no echo. It was an awakening." Beneath the soil of Gwelio lay chambers of molten rock long sealed off by layers of cooled lava and buried jungle. The quakes had fractured those chambers, releasing pressure built over centuries. What followed was not an eruption in a dramatic, explosive sense that captured European imaginations. No mountain exploding into flame, but something slower, more insidious. A series of phreatomagmatic surges, superheated water mixed with magma, shot clouds of deadly gas into the lowlands. Carbon dioxide heavier than air crept silently into valleys, suffocating sleeping animals than people. Dozens of villages in the Oyo Basin began to die without fire, without warning, just breath that would not come. Koum led his people up the hillside paths toward the high ridges where the air felt thinner and the trees swayed nervously. But for many, it was already too late. Elder women collapsed in their huts. Infants stopped crying in their mothers' arms. Even the dogs lay down and did not rise. The deadly gas, a mix of CO2 and hydrogen sulfide, poured into homes and lungs with silent cruelty. Koum, gasping and coughing, looked down upon his village, and saw it dimming like a fire choked of oxygen. But still the earth moved. By noon, geysers of boiling water erupted from river beds, and the river itself began to turn warm, then hot, then scalding. Fish floated dead by the hundreds, and their silvery bodies caught sunlight like a terrible constellation on the water. No one in Bamba knew the word limnic eruption, nor had they heard of Lake Nyos in Cameroon, which decades later would suffer a similar fate. But the principle was the same. A trapped pocket of gas in subterranean chambers had burst, and death rode it like mist on windless air. News traveled slowly in 1919. The nearest colonial station was 3 days' march away, and its officials were more preoccupied with ivory taxes and influenza quarantines than geological anomalies. When a trading caravan from the coast stumbled upon the abandoned remnants of Mbamba, dozens of bodies intact yet lifeless, smoke drifting eerily through the empty animal pens. They assumed poison or rebellion. They could not comprehend that the land itself had become the murderer. And so the true nature of the Mbamba disaster remained obscured, filed away as a native tragedy in dusty colonial records. But among the survivors, scattered in the highlands and mangrove fringes, a different truth lived on. The earth had a memory, they said, and it had been angered. The spirits beneath Gwelio had not been placated. Koum, though weakened by the gas, lived to speak of it. "It was not fire that took our people," he said to his grandson many years later. "It was the breath of the mountain, and the breath of the mountain is death." As the smoke darkened the skies above the Oyo Basin, turning midday into dusk, the broader landscape bore witness to a growing horror that stretched beyond the shattered shell of Mbamba. Villages downstream, where the river widened and the land dipped into gentle valleys, began to suffer the invisible siege. The survivors of Mbamba, who had fled into the forests, carried nothing but the clothes on their backs and the stinging in their lungs. Kumwanyoka, the once proud leader now coughing blood into a woven leaf, stumbled through underbrush with a handful of children and 2 other adults, searching for higher ground, for wind, for any sign that the earth's vengeance had a limit. Behind them, the sky glowed a sickly amber, not with fire, but with dust and ash, a strange volcanic haze that filtered sunlight into a molten syrup of heat and dread. The jungle, once alive with chittering birds and cicadas, had grown mute. Even the insects, it seemed, had fled or perished. In this unnatural silence, the whispers of myth began to stir again. What if the old tales were not merely allegories, but warnings left behind by ancestors who had witnessed similar wrath generations ago, buried now under vines and forgetfulness? Coom's mind wandered to the forbidden stories, the chants never sung before foreigners. The Ndogo Warify, the breath of the sleeping demon. And now it had stirred. To the west, word finally reached the Belgian outpost at Simbay. A fortified collection of wooden barracks and rusting train parts meant more for intimidating locals than defending any frontier. A Hutu porter, barefoot and wide-eyed, arrived after running for 2 days through terrain thick with panic. The garrison commander, Captain Lucien Merckx, half-drunk and wholly disinterested in native confusion, dismissed the man's cries of death fog and poisoned rivers. But the village priest, Père André Lemoyne, a gaunt Jesuit with too many memories of the war in Europe, listened more carefully. The description chilled him. A silent killer. He had seen such death before, chlorine clouds drifting over trenches in Belgium, the corpses piled with no wounds, mouths open in final fruitless breaths. Could it be? No artillery here, no factories. But nature, perhaps, was capable of its own mustard gas. Lemoyne pushed for a scouting party. Merckx scoffed, but begrudgingly allowed 2 Congolese trackers and a sergeant to investigate. By the time they arrived at the Oyo, the river had turned gray, opaque, and steaming in places. Trees close to the banks had withered as if blighted overnight. The men covered their faces in soaked cloth as they descended into the basin and were struck by the eerie uniformity of death. People had not died in struggle, but in paralysis. Livestock lay in tidy rows, eyes open. A child's ball floated in a pond near the remains of a school. No marks on the bodies except the emptiness in their lungs. The sergeant, terrified and confused, ordered the team to retreat immediately. Something deeper than disease had struck here. It was not rebellion nor hunger. It was the ground itself, turning on its tenets. Meanwhile, across the highland ridge near Lake Aru, other survivors began to runaways from villages as far as 30 kilometers apart. They spoke in trembling voices of gas that came like mist, of rivers that hissed and spat steam, of trees exploding from within. Their trunks split like thunder had struck them. An old woman from the village of Kunda claimed to have seen a stone idol cry blood before the air turned sour. Some believed it was divine punishment. Others said it was white man's magic gone wrong. Coom, though feverish and weak, took charge of the encampment. He organized scouts to test the wind's direction, posted lookouts for signs of further tremors, and instructed mothers to bury cloth in moist earth and wrap it around their children's faces. There was no medicine, no relief, only the instinct to survive. In a small mission hospital to the south, a nurse named Adeline Morrow attempted to make sense of the scattered survivors arriving barefoot, soot-smeared, and half-suffocated. One child's lungs collapsed hours after arriving, though he showed no external injury. Another woman bled from the nose and ears, trembling as though possessed. There were no reference books for this, no protocols. Adeline began recording symptoms, mapping the villages spoken of, sketching a rough perimeter of the affected zone. She guessed it spanned nearly 50 kilometers in diameter, a death ring whose center remained elusive, though Mount Gweliel's reappearance and all the accounts painted a dark center point. Yet the mountain itself had not erupted in fire. That was the strangest part. The textbook spoke of smoke and ash columns of lava rivers. This was something else, a killer unseen, except in its consequences. 3 weeks later, a British geologist named Jonathan Frayne, recently arrived from Sierra Leone to consult on mining contracts, was dispatched from Nairobi to investigate. Armed with journals, measuring devices, and a missionary guide, he descended upon the Oyo Basin with equal parts skepticism and curiosity. But what he found stunned him. Pockmarked terrain where gas vents had opened and closed like mouth. Volcanic rocks still warm to the touch. And then, the ultimate revelation. A thin film of dried bubbles on the surface of a lake near Gilio. Evidence of a carbon dioxide release, possibly from lake overturn on magmatic intrusion. Frayne took samples, logged data, and wrote in his diary, "This region has suffered a limnic disaster of a magnitude I have never encountered. The victims died not by disease nor conflict, but by an act of geologic suffocation. I fear many hundreds are dead. I fear more may follow. Back at the Highland encampment, Coombs' condition worsened. His lungs, already ravaged by the first wave of gas, struggled in the thin air. But before he passed, he called for his grandson, 6-year-old Tamari, and pressed into his hand a carved stone pendant, shaped like the old god of the river. "Remember," he whispered, "the earth remembers what was taken. Respect the stone, the root, and the breath beneath. Or will come again," as rains finally came in late July, diluting the poison and cooling the earth. Some life returned. Birds reappeared. New saplings pushed up from the cracked forest floor, but Mbamba was gone, erased. The Oyo ran slower now, choked by silt and death. Reports were filed, but few read them. The Belgian authorities blamed an unusual ground vapor release. The mission called it divine mystery. The survivors called it a warning. And beneath Mount Gueliel, though the breath had stopped, the earth waited. Not dead, only dreaming again. Months had passed since the breath of the earth rose and smothered life in the Oyo Basin. The world had moved on, distracted by the aftermath of a European war, shifting colonial borders and distant uprisings in unfamiliar lands. What remained in the basin, however, was not merely a scar but a silence that resisted the march of time. Even as trees returned and animals cautiously re-entered the edges of the dead zone, the core remained barren, a pale wasteland, brittle with mineral crusts and devoid of birdsong. It was here that the last remnants of the catastrophe lingered, not in sight, but in memory, buried in the minds of those who had seen friends fall without a sound, who had watched the river choke on its own breath. Koen Wanaka's camp in the highlands had become a haven for displaced families. Tents stitched from woven leaves and burlap lined the hillsides. Elders taught children how to listen for wind changes, how to read the sky not just for rain but for death. Myths turned into law. Rituals long forgotten. Songs sung only during eclipses or after earthquakes returned with new urgency. The past was now a weapon, wielded not for power but for defense against the unpredictable wrath of a living earth. Tamari, Coombs' grandson, now orphaned and solemn, wore the pendant always. He did not speak often, but when he did, others listened. The stone figure he wore was said to be centuries old, carved by the river people before written memory. A French missionary tried once to take it for study. Tamari had bitten his hand. Even among outsiders, there was unease around the boy. Some said he had survived the gas by whispering to the roots. Others claimed he had seen a shadow walk through the fog and offer him a choice, to speak for the mountain or to fall like the rest. Whatever the truth, Tamari stood at the front of every burial, silent, eyes fixed not on the earth but on the horizon, as though watching for the next omen. In the capital of the colony, Leopoldville, reports compiled by Frayne and Lemoyne reached a dusty shelf in the back room of the colonial archives. The document spoke of a rare limnic eruption, where carbon dioxide stored deep under the lake bed had been violently released due to seismic tremors or subsurface collapse. It had crept over the ground, displacing air, suffocating all living things in its path. There was a precedent, small-scale incidents in Europe, minor cases in Asia, but nothing of this scope. Frayne recommended permanent geological monitoring. The government balked at the cost. Africa, to them, was a place of extraction, not preservation. And so the papers sat unread, misfiled under events miscellaneous. But the earth did not forget. In early November, strange activity began near Lake Uru, 15 kilometers from the original site. Fishermen reported fish floating belly up, days before any visible change. Goats collapsed in the fields without wound or struggle. The wind, usually from the west, began blowing east with unusual force. At night, some said they heard low humming beneath the soil. Too rhythmic for wind, too deep for animals. Missionary school was evacuated after children fell sick with no fever, coughing as if drowning on dry land. Lemoyne, now returned to the area, led a team to the edge of the lake. What he found terrified him. Water temperatures had risen by several degrees, and at certain points the lake exhaled tiny bubbles that stank of rot and minerals. He warned the bishop. The bishop informed the district governor. The governor, fearing panic, issued a gag order on rumors of atmospheric irregularities. The silence would cost dearly. On the night of December 2nd, the lake breathed again. This time it was smaller, more focused, but deadlier in concentration. A village of 65 vanished in their sleep. Chickens fell from their perches without noise. Oil lamps remained lit beside cold hands. Lemoyne's team, stationed 5 kilometers away, awoke to the sound of silence. The birds were gone, and the air felt unnaturally still. Rushing to the site, they found death without fire, without flood, without time to pray. Lemoyne collapsed days later, unable to reconcile the facts. He wrote only one sentence in his final journal: "We do not live on the earth, we live inside her mouth." The pattern repeated in subtle, terrifying rhythm. Not every venting was fatal, but each was a warning. Animals fled without prompting. Elders grew restless. Tamari, now nearly 10, began carving new shapes in the dirt, spirals inside triangles, the symbol of Gueliel now encased in something older unknown. Some said he dreamed of fire rising from water. Others said he did not sleep at all. By early 1920, scientists in Nairobi and Cape Town took notice. Freyne's reports were shared with academics in Europe. A French volcanologist named Henri Dubois arrived with new instruments. Determined to prove that Africa's lakes were more than decorative backdrops for safari maps. He confirmed deep saturation of CO2 in several lakes across Central Africa. Lake Kivu, Lake Nyos, Lake Aru. "They are sleeping giants," he wrote, breathing slowly, quietly, but they breathe death. But warnings did not stop commerce. A Belgian rubber plantation was established near the Aru Basin in 1921. Workers complained of headaches, dizziness, and a strange taste in the morning air. They were told to hydrate and work harder. In 1923, a small eruption killed 28. The plantation doubled production the following year. The survivors of Mbamba scattered, never to return. Some joined distant tribes, others left for cities. But the memory endured. And once a year, Tamari, now a teenager, climbed a ridge above the Oyo, knelt where the fog first touched the soil, and left an offering. A carved mask half buried in volcanic ash. No one knew who taught him the ritual. No one dared interrupt, for they remembered what the missionaries forgot, what the governors ignored, and what the rivers whispered each night beneath the moonlight. That Africa's heart was not dead, only wounded. And a wounded heart, no matter how quiet, eventually beats again. Let's jump to next story. Story 3. In the waning months of 1919, while the empires of Europe licked their wounds and redrew borders and marble halls, far from the orchestration of diplomats and generals, a silent storm gathered in the low-lying rice plains of Burma, then a colony under British rule. Mandalay, ancient in soul and teetering between centuries, was no stranger to natural hardship, but this season bore a peculiar menace that no rain or famine could explain. It started with the wind, thick and strange, brushing the skin like the breath of fevered lungs. Locals called it Amin's curse, a name rooted in whispered legends about a long-dead monk who cursed colonial medics for defiling sacred land with their foreign laboratories. While the tale served as folklore and warning alike, few truly believed in its literal danger. Until the fever arrived, riding on gusts of unseasonal warmth that danced through village huts and market stalls like a thief hunting in the dark. The first victim was an English railway inspector named Charles Pennom, found sprawled inside a compartment of the Rangoon-Mandalay line. His skin was pale and waxy, lips tinted blue, and his tongue, according to the mortician, had turned as black as lacquer. Officials muttered about heat stroke, even as the rains continued to lash the city, dousing any notion of summer. But within a week, 10 more followed, laborers from the teak yards, an Anglo-Indian schoolteacher, a Buddhist nun, and 2 porters from the customs office. All displayed similar symptoms: hallucinations, uncontrollable shivering, then paralysis of the lungs. It was the speed that struck terror. Within 3 days of the first cough, the body would shut down entirely, as if overtaken by a toxin no prayer nor remedy could counter. The British colonial authorities, ever eager to preserve their fragile illusion of order, attempted to suppress the news. Dr. William Cartwright, the portly chief medical officer of Mandalay, issued vague bulletins on respiratory ailments aggravated by monsoonal damp. But the people knew. Mothers sewed red cloth talismans above doorways. Temple gongs rang day and night. And in the Shu and Bin monastery, Monks who hadn't chanted in public since the fall of the Kanbong dynasty once again filled the air with urgent psalms for divine protection. Despite their efforts, the affliction, soon dubbed Black Lung of the East, spread with the precision of a vengeful spirit. By late August, entire districts were marked with soot symbols warning of contamination. The city's crematorium ran without pause. British soldiers, normally tasked with patrolling the Irrawaddy ports, were now seen wearing gauze masks, herding bodies into cartloads and lighting pyres at night under military guard. The disease knew no border. Chinese traders, Indian migrants, Burmese nobility, and colonial aristocrats all fell alike. The Governor-General's own niece, a girl of 11, died within 48 hours of her first sneeze. Still, to the outside world, Mandalay remained a footnote. Its letters censored, its telegraph reports altered, and its pleas ignored. Yet amidst this chaos, the most damning element wasn't biological, it was political. For beneath the veil of contagion, something else stirred: opportunity. As health officers floundered and military oversight tightened, local resistance groups, long dormant and fractured, began to unify. The Young Mandalay League, a nationalist outfit branded seditious by colonial officers, found new voice in the failure of the crown to protect its subjects. Posters appeared overnight, hand-inked and nailed to monastery doors. The plague is their gift, our deaths their silence. There were whispers that the disease was not natural, but engineered. That strange men with British accents had been seen spreading powders in the irrigation ditches weeks before the outbreak. That cargo crates labeled medicinal herbs from Liverpool contained no plants at all, but glimmering vials sealed with lead and glass. Such rumors, lacking evidence but rich in resentment, spread like the disease itself. In truth, no one could prove anything. But belief, in times of suffering, is more powerful than truth. By early September, the city's structure had crumbled. Banks shuttered. Markets operated only at dawn. Priests refused to administer last rites for fear of infection. And even the British consulate, a symbol of unshakable imperial authority, stood hollow, its marble facade stained with smoke and sap from impromptu funeral fires. In this vacuum, a new kind of order emerged. Resistance cells, guided by folk healers and radical students, began organizing makeshift clinics and temples. Burmese women, once relegated to household invisibility, took up arms, daggers hidden in sarongs, poisons brewed from roots passed down by midwives. And leading them all was a figure previously considered no more than a pamphlet poet. Nay Thura, once jailed for anti-British speeches in Rangoon, now returned to Mandalay as both healer and revolutionary. With a fever mark still healing on his neck, Thura gave speeches from rooftops, rallying both the sick and the enraged. To many, it appeared the disease had not just killed, it had awakened. By the second week of September 1919, Mandalay was no longer a city of the living, but a theater of survival. What once was a bustling colonial outpost had become a fractured realm split between the sick and the spared, the powerless and the defiant. British authorities had fled inland, setting up a heavily fortified quarantine zone in Pine Gwyn, leaving behind pamphlets instructing citizens to remain calm, boil water, and pray for containment. But prayers had already turned to silence in the mouths of children. The streets of Zigio Market, once bursting with teak, silk, and chatter, now echoed with the groans of the dying and the crackle of burning funeral wood. And as the Black Lung's grip extended further, so too did the question that now pulsed through every alley and monastery. Was this a punishment or a reckoning? Inside the ruins of the former British Administrative Hall, ironically repurposed as a sanctuary for orphans and dying elders, Nathura and his loosely knit council of monks, former soldiers, and apothecaries met each dusk under the broken rafters of the old colonial courtroom. There, beneath the faded Union Jack still bolted to the wall, plans were laid, not just for the treatment of the afflicted, but for the reimagining of Mandalay itself. What had begun as a health crisis had now fermented into open rebellion. The city's telegraph cables had been cut deliberately. Barricades were erected at the mouths of major roads, and night sentries with handmade weapons stood watch against looters and patrols alike. The plague had burned the roots of foreign rule, and in the vacuum of imperial absence, the city flirted with something older than politics, communal survival, bonded by shared tragedy. And yet, not all were drawn to the cause. In the southern district of Kayaks, a man named Ongala, once a trader in opium and colonial favors, used the chaos to amass power of a different nature. He offered medicines hoarded from British military stocks, water purified with iodine from abandoned barracks, and mercenary protection to the highest bidder. He styled himself a governor, wearing a stolen army jacket with mismatched medals, and demanded tributes of rice, gold, and bodies for labor. Villagers who refused often vanished, while Nathura tried to rekindle the soul of Mandalay with the spirit of resistance and memory. Angdala fed on fear, becoming a plague unto the plague. His growing militia, the Black Rain Circle, was as feared as the fever itself, men armed with stolen rifles and faces masked with damp cloth dipped in quinine. Some said they drank the blood of the infected to become immune. Others claimed they had a doctor among them, an Anglo-Swiss exile who once worked for the British East Medical Syndicate, now hiding in the swamps, experimenting with disease samples taken from the first victims. This fractured war for the city escalated when a supply barge, rumored to carry crates of morphine, quinine, and preserved meats, was spotted moored at the northern Irrawaddy dock. Thura's rebels and Dala's mercenaries both raced through ash-choked roads to seize it. The confrontation, which would come to be known as the Dock Massacre, lasted only 20 minutes but reshaped the fate of Mandalay. Gunshots shattered the pre-dawn silence. Men collapsed without knowing who had struck them. And in the chaos, a stray mortar, likely from a stolen British launcher, ignited a cache of kerosene, engulfing the barge in a fireball visible for miles. No one reached the supplies. And as the barge sank, so did Mandalay's last hope for formal medicine. What followed was a dark week, later remembered only in fragments, half muttered by fever victims and preserved in the dusty notebooks of itinerant monks. Rain fell for 5 days without pause, soaking the piers and washing the ashes into the rice fields. Dogs roamed the streets in packs. A colony of survivors took refuge in the ruins of the Mandalay Palace, where they built bamboo huts within the sacred walls, lighting incense in rooms once adorned by royalty. Nay Thura, wounded in the Dock Massacre, lay recovering in the underground tunnels of the Schwenendahl Monastery, his breath shallow and body fevered. With their leader silenced, the resistance flickered, but did not die. Mothers armed themselves with sickles. Monks offered rice and whispered chants at checkpoints. A group of teenage girls ambushed a Black Rain patrol near the south gate and returned with rifles and canned food, becoming legends overnight. Meanwhile, whispers of the plague crossed borders. Traders in Yunnan province refused to enter Burma, leaving caravans stranded. In the British offices in Calcutta, news of the outbreak was diluted and dismissed, blamed on native superstition, with carefully phrased warnings sent to consuls in Rangoon and Penang. But some saw deeper. A Tamil journalist named Raghav Menon, traveling undercover through the Irrawaddy Valley, documented the spread with cold precision, sending reports to underground newspapers in Delhi. His articles, later reprinted by the Hindustan Voice, accused the British colonial offices of intentional neglect, if not outright biological testing. The accusations were denied vehemently, but seeds of doubt had been planted. In the words of one column, "If Mandalay burns, let history record who poured the oil." By October, the fever began to wane, not due to cure but exhaustion. The disease had claimed what it could, and its black banner fluttered no more. But what remained of Mandalay was not what had been. It was a city stitched by memory, reborn not in joy, but in resilience. A place that had endured the silence of the world, the cruelty of its rulers, and the cold grip of an invisible killer. And the people, scarred, scattered, half-starved, no longer asked for salvation. They asked for justice. When the final fogs of sickness lifted and the nights once more grew quiet, Mandalay stood altered. Not by recovery, but by revelation. What the black lung had failed to kill, it had transformed. The once pristine lines of colonial authority had melted into irrelevance. Where British officials had been absent, the people had governed themselves. Where hospitals had closed their doors, temple courtyards became infirmaries. Even the rhythms of daily life had changed. Gongs now marked the hour of water sharing. Street patrols were organized not by military decree, but by elders elected by their blocks, and bamboo flags fluttered over each ward. Not as marks of loyalty to empire, but to memory to survival. And while the fever itself retreated into myth, the structure that had once pretended to protect the people lay in ruins, its marble symbols blackened, its promises exposed as empty. Dr. Cartwright, the last senior colonial medical officer in the region, was found weeks after his disappearance. His body was recovered from a drainage canal on the outskirts of the northern quarter, bloated and marked with ritualistic flower petals around the head. No one claimed responsibility, though many speculated that it had been a message, not to him, but to London. The British response to the outbreak had been silence. There had been no reinforcements, no humanitarian columns, only quiet instruction to hold the line and avoid panic. That cowardice had been documented, dissected, and remembered by those left behind. In the diary of a teenage survivor named the Ida Nguyen, later found in the ruins of the Nguyen Library, she wrote, "They called us subjects. But they would not touch us even to save us. Perhaps it is better. We will never again ask." By the end of 1919, as winter began to whisper through the dry fields beyond the Irrawaddy, Nithura emerged again. Still weak, his hair newly grayed from illness and grief, he spoke not of vengeance, but of permanence. He called for the establishment of a Mandalay Council, an independent civilian body of monks, teachers, herbalists, and tradesmen, to oversee the rebuilding of their society, without interference from colonial hands. His voice, though ragged, rang with the clarity of purpose that only the nearly dead possess. "Let them rule the cities they saved," he said. "But Mandalay will be ruled by those who suffered with her." And though the British eventually reasserted control over other Burmese regions, Mandalay became a puzzle they could not solve. They sent administrators, but they found no clerks. They sent inspectors, but no one opened their doors. Taxes were ignored. Trials were held in monastery courtyards, not British courts. The bureaucracy had been hollowed, replaced by something messier but more honest, a fellowship of survivalists. But the story of Mandalay's plague could not be contained to the Irrawaddy Plains. Smugglers and merchants carried tales east into Siam, west into Bengal, north into Yunnan. And with those tales came a strange kind of admiration, not just for how the city endured, but for how it rejected the silence of empire. In Calcutta, revolutionaries invoked Mandalay in speeches demanding self-rule. In Hanoi, students painted murals of women in sarongs wielding rifles beneath a black sun. And in London, though the government dismissed the accounts as native hysteria, a single article published in the Manchester Courier described Mandalay as the jewel the crown lost in its own shadow. For once, the center of the world had turned to listen, but Mandalay no longer cared for its ears. Perhaps most haunting was what the fever left behind. Not death, but change. The young grew fearless. Children who had lit funeral fires with bare hands now studied law beneath oil lanterns. Girls who had once been silent behind walls now led patrols and read aloud in the streets. Even the monks, long passive in politics, entered the fray, not with swords but with memory. They wrote scrolls. They recorded names. They archived the failure of empire, not in condemnation but in witness. It was said that the dead had given the living a new kind of clarity, the knowledge that Mandalay would never again be governed by a language foreign to its soil. And the black lung itself? It never returned. Not to Mandalay nor to Burma. Some claimed it had been a freak mutation of jungle spores, or an unintended side effect of chemical trials buried beneath bureaucratic dust. Others whispered that it had never been real, that it was simply the ghost of war, made manifest in sickness. In time, science would offer no answers. Medical records vanished, and the names of the dead were left to be etched in prayer stones and family chants. But to those who had lived it, nothing about it was mythical. The coughs, the screams, the burning boats and the flowers pressed into the mouths of corpses. Those were real. And if there were no doctors to verify the symptoms, the survivors themselves had become the only living proof. By 1920, Mandalay's name had become a quiet anthem of defiance across Asia, whispered in the tongues of movements rising like smoke in distant provinces. And while the British would never officially acknowledge their failure there, they stopped speaking of it altogether. Their maps still listed Mandalay in ink, but they no longer sent governors or missionaries. It had become a place between categories, not rebellion, not statehood, but something older. A city not built by rulers, but kept alive by memory, bone, and fire. And in the sacred heart of the Schwanendel Monastery, where once the sick had cried in the dark, a wall bore an inscription painted in red ochre. Its author unknown, its language simple. We were left alone. And yet, we did not die. That was the last lesson of the fever winds. Not how many had perished, but how many chose, in the shadow of death, to live without permission. Let's jump to next story. Story 4. In the waning months of 1919, as the world beyond Ceylon began to recover from the ravages of the Great War and the shadows of the Spanish flu pandemic, Colombo simmered with an eerie calm. The humid air clung to the colonial port city like a damp shroud, and the scent of salt, sandalwood, and spice wafted through the narrow alleyways of Petta and Fort. Beneath the surface of British imperial control and the rhythm of portside commerce, a storm brewed, not only in the sky above the Indian Ocean, but in the delicate weave of society, already fraying from disease, poverty, and a growing resentment toward imperial order. That year, the rains came early, and omened, some said. Drawn from the old Sinhala calendars and whispered through ancestral superstition. Others blamed the freak tides on a restless moon, but no one could have foreseen the calamity that would erupt over the island nation, nor the way it would twist nature, man, and the brittle veneer of civilization into chaos. It began not with thunder, but with silence. On June 5th, a week before the usual onset of the Almanzon, the fishermen at Ngombo reported that the waters had grown still, eerily so. Dolphins vanished, birds migrated inland, and for days the sea refused to breathe. In Colombo, the signs were more subtle. The sewers began to swell, the air grew metallic, and the dogs howled at night as if mourning the dead before their time. At the Colonial Meteorological Office, a junior Sinhalese clerk named Mahinda Gunasekara noticed the barometric readings plummeting at a rate unmatched in local records. When he brought this anomaly to his British superior, Lieutenant Charles Dalham, he was laughed off. The natives always panic when the sky sneezes, Dalham said, tapping ash from a cigarette into a teacup. But Mahinda persisted, sending telegrams to Kandy and Batticaloa, which returned similar abnormalities, rising underground pressure, dead birds, sulfurous air. Still, no official bulletin was issued. The British administration, still weary from wartime inflation and local protests, was more concerned with keeping laborers in the tea plantations and cargo flowing through the port. Then came June 11th, the day now etched into local memory as the Great Drowning. At dawn the sea surged, not in waves, but as if the entire coastline had risen by 2 meters in a single breath. Ships moored at the harbor snapped from their anchors. Streets flooded in minutes, inundating railway tracks and shanty towns alike. In Petta, hundreds were trapped in collapsing shops, their cries swallowed by the roar of brown water coursing through the bazaars. The Gal faced green, once a promenade for colonial elites, turned into a lagoon of floating furniture and lifeless bodies. In the government quarters, panic erupted as communication lines failed. Mahinda, still at his desk, scribbled the last recorded pressure at 923 millibars before the ceiling of the weather station caved in, crushing his torso and pinning him beneath beams and glass. He survived long enough to scrawl the words underground fault, liquefaction, in his ledger before his breath failed. For the British, this was not merely a natural disaster, it was a political crisis. Governor Sir Cedric Weatherby, facing growing accusations of negligence, ordered martial law within 24 hours of the flood. Troops patrolled the streets in makeshift rafts, guarding warehouses of grain and medicine from desperate mobs. Aid distribution was limited to British nationals and registered loyalists, a euphemism that excluded much of the native Tamil, Moor and Sinhalese population. Rumors spread that wells had been poisoned, that the empire was punishing Colombo for rising nationalist sentiment. In Slave Island, where the railway barracks and dock workers lived, the unrest boiled into riots. 3 colonial constables were killed with rusted machetes. Retaliations followed swiftly. Entire blocks set ablaze under suspicion of harboring rebels. The flood had not only drowned homes, but exposed the fragile and festering rift between the rulers and the ruled. By the 3rd day, a second catastrophe struck. A landslide, triggered by the now saturated hills east of the city, crushed entire neighborhoods in Barela and Narahempeda. The red earth flowed like lava, burying schools, temples, and homes under meters of debris. Survivors clawing through the mud with bare hands, uncovered fragments of lives, half a doll, a sodden wedding sari, a torn flag from a long-forgotten celebration. British soldiers, fearing disease outbreaks, set fire to unclaimed corpses. The smoke mingled with the monsoon rain, painting the sky in hues of crimson and gray. One soldier of Private Andrew Larkins wrote in his diary, "This place is no longer part of the crown. It belongs to the dead. His words, smuggled out by a passing journalist from Madras, would become a rallying cry for the independence movement years later. Meanwhile, amidst this chaos, a strange anomaly was discovered in the Old Town district. A submerged underground chamber, previously hidden beneath a colonial-era warehouse, collapsed during the flood. Inside, rescue workers found dozens of sealed crates marked EIC 1810, East India Company relics that should not have existed anymore. Inside were scrolls, coins, and most intriguingly, small vials labeled in Latin and Persian. A British chemist, Dr. Walter Bensley, was flown in to examine the contents. He discovered that the vials contained strains of botulinum toxin, long thought to have been an abandoned British experiment in the early 19th century. The revelation sparked panic in the upper echelons of the colonial administration, which feared exposure of a long-buried scandal that the British prior had experimented with biochemical agents on native populations. Within hours, the site was sealed off and all local witnesses detained or silenced. But rumors cannot be drowned. Word spread that the monsoon had not been natural, that it was nature's vengeance. Awakened by old sins buried under colonial lies, monks from Kelaniya Temple declared it a karmic reckoning. Anti-imperialist pamphlets circulated, calling it the reckoning tide. And in a small house near Cinnamon Gardens, an elderly woman named Amarwathi, whose son had died in the flood, sat silently with her grandson and taught him words his father once dreamed of chanting in protest. Sri Lanka for its children. In the weeks that followed the cataclysm, Colombo transformed into a city of shadows and ash. The rains had stopped, but they left behind a different kind of deluge, one of suspicion, starvation, and decay. Disease spread rapidly through the flooded quarters. Cholera, typhoid, and dysentery ran rampant through the makeshift camps set up outside city limits, where displaced families slept under torn burlap or scrap wood. The colonial hospitals had neither the capacity nor the willingness to treat the local wounded en masse, choosing instead to prioritize the preservation of order. The dead were buried without names, without ceremonies, their graves marked by sticks or stones, or often nothing at all. Some were never found. Some were never looked for. In this quiet collapse, the real disaster began, not in the noise of the water's rage, but in the silence that followed. Amid the carnage, whispers of sabotage began to infect every conversation. A small, covert group of Sinhalese nationalists known as Vijay Handa, the Electric Voice, claimed responsibility for exposing the British bioarsenal buried beneath the city, insisting the monsoon had only done what conscience had failed to. They circulated leaflets soaked in red ink, declaring, "The empire drowned in its own poison." Though no formal connection could be established between the group and the flooding, the message caught fire. Pamphlets appeared on walls, nailed to trees, hidden in crates of rice, or slipped under church doors. It was not just about independence anymore. It was about justice, about reckoning, about truth. To many locals, the deluge was no longer a natural event, but a divine unveiling, a purging of sins long buried under stone and steel. As the British scrambled to contain both the outbreak and the political blowback, Governor Weatherby authorized the formation of a special investigative committee to examine the alleged historical anomalies uncovered during the disaster. Leading the team was Colonel Reginald Mercer, an officer from the Colonial Intelligence Bureau, with a reputation for secrecy and brutal efficiency. Mercer had served in Egypt and India, quelling rebellions and eliminating dissent with surgical coldness. In Colombo, he was tasked with erasing the stains left by the flood, records, testimonies, and artifacts alike. Over the course of 2 weeks, nearly every person who had worked at the warehouse or witnessed the crate excavation was either relocated, imprisoned under colonial health ordinances, or quietly vanished. Dr. Bensley, the chemist who had initially catalogued the vials, died in what the British press called a lab explosion in Kandy. His journal, however, surfaced months later through underground networks. An account in his own hand of testing done on villagers in the 1830s by order of the East India Company, trials disguised as medical aid. While Mercer silenced one narrative, another continued to grow. Mahinda Gunsakar's younger brother, Dylan, a former schoolteacher turned firebrand orator, emerged from the ruins with a mission. Armed with copies of his brother's final notes and a vial salvaged from the wreckage, Dylan began organizing underground lectures across Ceylon, presenting not only the science behind the unnatural weather patterns, but the moral and historical evidence of the empire's crimes. His followers grew daily: dock workers, students, monks, even disillusioned colonial clerks. They called themselves the Sons of the Monsoon. Dylan believed that the flood was not the end, but the beginning of something new, an awakening of the land and its people. He urged resistance not through armed violence, but through relentless truth, urging them to let the tide carry the lies away. But the truth, however righteous, rarely flows unchallenged. In late July, a second smaller flood struck after a torrential night of rains. While not as destructive as the initial wave, it managed to cripple the already broken supply chains and wipe out the remaining infrastructure in the city center. It also gave Mercer an excuse to declare a state of permanent emergency. Under this legal umbrella, curfews were reinstated, arrests soared, and public assemblies were banned. Dylan was captured on August 3rd during a clandestine sermon at the ruins of the Gangramia Temple. He was beaten and detained, but no charges were filed. He was held in a private cell beneath the fort barracks and never seen again. His followers claimed they heard the ocean roaring near the dungeon walls, despite the sea being nearly a mile away. The final turning point came not from the people, but from nature itself. In September, seismic instruments recorded deep tremors beneath Colombo and Kegel. The old folk, who had been quietly watching the skies and tracking the water's return, warned of Nagani's curse, a fable about a serpent goddess who punished those who desecrated the land. Days later, fissures opened near the colonial rail lines, swallowing segments of track and derailing an outbound supply train carrying weapons bound for Trincomalee. It was seen by many as a final sign that the land itself had turned against its masters. With rumors of volcanic activity and fears of another wave of flooding, the British quietly began evacuating their families and valuables from Colombo. The exodus was not publicized, but locals noticed. The tea barons vanished, clubhouses emptied, and military vessels began appearing off the coast under the guise of routine drills. By October, a reluctant calm returned. The rain ceased, the air lightened, and the stink of rot faded into memory. But Colombo was not the same. It was no longer just a port, or a colony, or a city of palm trees and imperial order. It had become something else, something older, deeper. Beneath its cracked streets and ash-covered ruins lay truths no empire could drown. The monsoon had done more than destroy. It had uncovered. The people, those who survived, now carried with them the memory of water, of fire, of betrayal. And in that memory, seeds were planted, not just of resistance, but of rebirth. 1 year later, on the anniversary of the Great Drowning, the waters receded enough to reveal the foundations of an old Kandian shrine, buried beneath the city center, now visible from the cracked steps of the Victoria Arcade. No one remembered it being there. Yet the monks who came to pray at its edge insisted it had never left. It had never left. It had simply been waiting for the tide to speak. By 1920, the scars of the Great Drowning had begun to scab over, but they never truly healed. Colombo had been remade, not rebuilt by design, but rearranged by necessity. Cracked colonial columns were left standing like gravestones of a dying empire, while rows of charred timber and rusted rails wove through the city, like veins exposed after skin had been torn away. And although the British government issued formal statements of relief success and economic recovery, the city knew better. The cracks in the wall, both literal and symbolic, were too deep to be plastered over. The flood had not just altered the landscape, it had broken the illusion of permanence, the myth of invincibility that the empire had long cloaked itself in. But perhaps most crucially, it had disrupted the archives. When the waters receded for good in early January, what remained beneath them was not only stone and bone, but paper. Hundreds of sealed crates unearthed in basements and vaults across the city. Documents from the East India Company, private ledgers from the Crown Shipping Council, inventories of biological shipments marked with both chemical formulas and indigenous tribal symbols. The truth was no longer buried. It was now exposed, drying under the tropical sun like old linen, fragile but unmistakable. These papers made their way into the hands of academics, rogue journalists, and young revolutionaries who had seen their families drown not just in water, but in decades of imperial deceit. A few of these documents were translated and reprinted in Ceylonese dailies under pseudonyms. One paper, the Monsoon Ledger, began printing every Friday from a hidden press in Gao. Its mast had a single line in both Sinhala and English. "What the sea reveals cannot be unseen." Governor Weatherby, cornered by exposure and haunted by public outrage, resigned in disgrace, though the British Parliament framed it as an honorable retirement following personal health decline. Colonel Mercer vanished altogether, rumored to have returned to Britain, though many believed he had assumed a new identity, possibly operating under another colonial mission in Kenya or Malaya. But his shadow remained. Survivors of the fort barracks reported that even months later, strange crates continued to disappear from the harbor in unmarked vessels under cover of night, some said to be bound for secret facilities in Calcutta or Rangoon. The British never confirmed or denied these claims, but it became widely believed that the toxic arsenal beneath Colombo had not been destroyed, only relocated. In the absence of British control, a silent revolution fermented. The traditional ruling elite of the Kandyan provinces began aligning themselves with grassroots nationalist groups, funding publications, hosting secret symposiums in temples, and offering asylum to fugitive thinkers and scientists. Among them was Lakshmi Karanaratan, a young chemist from Madara who had studied under Dr. Bensley before his death. She led a movement to compile and translate the salvaged laboratory journals and vault inventories into public records. Her work, titled The Alchemy of Empire, published in 1922, would later be considered foundational to the anti-colonial scientific ethics movement throughout South Asia. She argued not just that the empire had weaponized science against the colonized, but that the land itself had developed antibodies. That nature, awakened through years of chemical violation, had finally responded. This theory gained curious support from an unexpected place: the weather. After the flood of 1919, the seasonal monsoons in Ceylon shifted. Rains became more erratic, sometimes skipping entire regions for months, then returning in furious torrents. Rivers rerouted, fish migrated to unfamiliar coastlines, and even the soil near former flood zones developed a strange red hue, rich with iron and unidentifiable organic compounds. Traditional farmers began refusing to plant in certain areas, calling them tainted. Elders in remote villages spoke of the earth-tasting poison. Environmentalists, both local and foreign, began quietly investigating, though many of their findings were suppressed or dismissed as folklore. One Dutch botanist, expelled from the country after publishing a report titled "Residual Toxins in Post-Monsoon Soil," later gave an interview in The Hague claiming that a second flood is inevitable, not of water but of consequence. Meanwhile, Colombo's surviving population adapted. The former colonial center split into districts, each governed informally by local councils. These councils, though disparate in structure, shared one guiding principle: never forget the flood. Each year on June 11th, they held silent processions to the ruins of the city's former government house, now a blackened shell overgrown with vines and fig roots. Survivors carried bottles of seawater, pouring them at the steps of the building, as a form of both remembrance and warning. Children were taught the story not just as history, but as sacred parable, the tale of an empire that believed itself untouchable until the ocean rose to speak. Monks incorporated it into teachings, poets into their verse, and across the nation, murals bloomed with images of waves crashing over marble pillars, of serpents curled around rifles, of sunflowers growing from skulls. By the late 1920s, the narrative had gone global. Anti-colonial movements in India, Burma, and even the Caribbean referenced the Crimson Monsoon as both event and metaphor. In literature, it was reimagined in dozens of forms: a wrathful goddess's vengeance, a secret war against time, a purifying catastrophe. In politics, it became a rallying cry: let it flood again. Scholars at Cambridge and Yale debated its implications not only on environmental ethics, but on post-imperial psychology. Was it nature's revolt or man's punishment? An accident or a reckoning? No one could answer with certainty, but all agreed on one thing. The empire had lost something in Colombo that could never be recovered: its mystique. In the final years of British presence on the island, the fort was reduced to a skeleton of rusted gates and pigeon-infested corridors. No new ships docked without inspection, and even the loyalists who once toasted to the Queen now did so with unease. They no longer spoke of when order would return, but rather what else lies beneath. In a way, the monsoon had flooded not just the land, but the future itself. It had altered every expectation, destabilized every promise. And in that waterlogged uncertainty, something new was born. An island no longer waiting to be ruled, but remembering how to resist. And beneath all that, in the ruined tunnels below the old port warehouse, a single vial remained untouched. It sat in the mud, cork sealed, label faded. No one ever found it. Or if they did, they never told a soul. Perhaps that, too, was the point. Some poisons are best left in the dark. But some truths, like floods, always find a way to rise. Let's jump to next story. Story 5. The sun rose like a furnace over the banks of the Kaduna River, its orange glare shimmering off the murky water as if to forewarn of the fury to come. It was the Harmattan season when the air turned dry and brittle and the land cracked under the sun's relentless weight. Yet the villagers of Garinbako, an old settlement tucked deep within the savannah near Zaria, paid no mind to omens. They had survived the influenza epidemic that had swept through their land a year before, taking with it children, elders, and entire lineages. They had withstood colonial conscription, tax raids, and arbitrary arrests from the British officers stationed nearby. What was a river to a people already hardened by years of quiet suffering? The elders told tales of the river's moods, of how it once burst its banks in the distant past, but no one alive had witnessed such destruction firsthand. And so, when the rains came early that year, no one worried. When the water levels rose gradually, no one panicked. They built their lives around the river, and they believed the river owed them its mercy. But rivers do not make oaths, and nature remembers debts humans forget. It started subtly, strange pulses in the current, a shifting of fish upriver, as if the animals themselves knew what the villagers could not. Farmers noticed the ground remained moist long after the rain stopped. Wells brimmed unusually fast. Then one evening, a boy named Yarrow was out setting traps when he heard a sound he could not describe. It was not thunder, though it rumbled. It was not wind, though it howled. It was a distant, roaring grief that grew louder with every heartbeat. Yarrow ran back into the village, screaming of something coming, of a beast in the water, but was dismissed as a child drunk on heat and hunger. The people returned to their night fires, the griots resumed their stories, and the elders lit their pipes, ignoring the unease curling in their stomachs. That night, the Kaduna River came alive with vengeance. Without warning, the river tore through its banks like a wild god unshackled. A surge of water, black with sediment and fury, rushed into Garinbako, devouring farms, homes, and people alike. The first to be swallowed were the thatched huts near the riverbank, sleepers who never woke. The mud walls collapsed like parchment, livestock were carried away like toys, and the mosque, the pride of the village, cracked in two. The flood was not a gentle rise, but a wall, tall and angry, cascading in waves as if the sky itself had burst open and fallen to earth. People screamed for children, for mothers, for the ancestors to intervene, but the water did not pause. It did not discriminate. It claimed all. In the chaos, Malam Musa, the old imam with a stooped-in eyes that had seen more death than years, tried to shepherd people to the granary, the highest structure in the village. He had seen the waters approach in a dream days before, though he had not spoken of it, afraid to be labeled senile. Now he fought against the current, soaked to his bones, guiding survivors through shoulder-high torrents, dragging the wounded and the young, even as bodies floated past like whispers of a lost past. By morning, Garinbako no longer existed. It was not a village anymore, it was a memory beneath the water. In the colonial station 40 miles east, the British district officer, Captain Lionel Farquhar, received a telegram from Kano that heavy rains had compromised the upstream dams. Unprecedented pressure on Kaduna Basin expected, it read. Farquhar sipped his tea slowly, his mustache twitching with irritation. "Damn natives will blame spirits," he muttered, throwing the cable aside. He was more concerned about his own bungalow's structural integrity than the fate of villagers he barely regarded as human. It wasn't until 3 days later, when House of Messengers arrived breathless, covered in river mud and ash, that he realized the magnitude of the catastrophe. Reports filtered in piecemeal. Hundreds feared drowned, crops gone, trade roads washed away. And beneath it all, whispers of something else, something no colonial report would capture. That the river's rage had not been natural. That it had been awakened, provoked, by something man-made. Captain Farquhar arrived in Garinbako 4 days after the flood, mounted on a horse whose hooves stumbled over what remained of the trade path, now a gash of mud and bone. Behind him marched 6 House of Conscripts in frayed uniforms, rifles slung uselessly over their shoulders, carrying with them not aid but orders. To assess damages, determine if the village would be relocated, and ensure no rebellion was fomenting in the ruins. But what they found stunned even the hardened colonial heart of Farquhar. The entire settlement had been erased. Not razed, not ruined, erased. Trees were uprooted, their roots twisted like skeletal hands. The few corpses recovered were grotesquely bloated, twisted in poses that betrayed terror and confusion. Crops had been peeled off the earth as though by a giant rake. Where homes had once stood was a brackish swamp, flies humming over debris, remnants of prayers and lullabies now embedded in the mud. What chilled Farquhar most, however, was the silence. Survivors did not wail or speak. They stared, wide-eyed, blank-faced. They did not move unless led. They had become ghosts of the river, hollowed out by a force that no empire could categorize or control. Among the few who remained lucid was Malam Musa, the imam, who sat beneath a fallen baobab tree, clutching a wet leather-bound Karen. His eyes followed Farquhar, but not with hostility, only a sorrow too old to translate. When questioned, Musa offered no direct answer. Instead, he muttered in Hausa about the seals broken and the waters remembering. He claimed that during the dry season of 1918, British engineers had blasted a channel upstream to redirect a tributary to power a colonial mill. In doing so, they had desecrated an ancient stone idol that had stood watch over the river junction for generations. It was no deity in any organized sense. It had no name in scripture, no temple, but it was honored, appeased, avoided. Children were forbidden to play nearby. Hunters made small offerings before crossing. It was not worship, Musa insisted. It was memory. We remembered what the water did when it was angry. Farquhar dismissed the tale as superstition, though his hand trembled slightly as he made note. He could not deny the correlation. The redirected watercourse had never stabilized. Complaints from nearby villages about rising water had been piling on his desk for months. Still, he could not include Musa's testimony in his report. There would be no mention of idols or warnings. Only language like unforeseen environmental reaction and excess rainfall compounded by inadequate infrastructure. But even as he wrote, Farquhar felt the river watching. It wasn't a thought. It was a presence, like a hand behind his neck that never touched but never left. He refused to stay the night. He departed before dusk, citing urgent matters in Zaria. He left behind a half-filled journal, a flask of rum, and a promise to send engineers that never arrived. The survivors, now barely 40 in number, did not wait. Led by Malam Musa and a handful of young men, including Yarrow, the boy who had first heard the river scream, they journeyed westward to the higher hills near Kafanchan. Musa had aged 10 years in a week, but his resolve had turned stone. "We rebuild where the river cannot climb," he said simply. And so they did, raising shelters from bamboo, replanting what seeds they had saved, and performing an old ritual not done in decades, the water binding. In silence, they carried small calabashes of river water uphill, and poured it into a dry well at the summit of a bare hill. This was not magic, it was memory. "We bind its hunger to a place above us," Lucid declared. "So when it wakes again, it must first climb to reach us." Weeks passed, then months. Other villages, those downstream, reported strange changes. Crops wilted overnight despite rain. Cattle would not drink from the river. A girl in Gimi spoke in tongues after bathing in its waters. Rumors began to spread of a sickness born not by wind, but by water. A fever that throbbed behind the eyes, followed by hallucinations and visions of drowning. Missionaries from Kaduna dismissed it as hysteria. Scientists from Lego sent samples and called it an aquatic strain of cerebral malaria. But in Garin Musa, the new village on the hill, they did not get sick. They drank from their well till dry ground and listened each night for the pulse of the river, though it could no longer be seen from their heights. In December 1919, as the Harmattan winds returned, Captain Farquhar fell ill. It began with a tremor in his left hand, then vision. He claimed to see water pooling under his floorboards, hear gurgling in the walls. "The river is following me," he told his manservant in one of his final coherent moments. "It's in the pipes." He was found dead in his bath, eyes wide open, lungs filled not with water, but with mud. Back in Garin Musa, on the night of the new year, Malam Musa lit a lantern at the edge of the hill. Yarrow asked if the river would return again, angrier, more violent. Musa replied, "The river has taken its revenge. Now we must live in respect, not in fear." Then he whispered the old proverb, "He who forgets the river's wrath will one day dream underwater." As the lantern flickered in the dark, the villagers stood in silence. Below them, the faint glint of the river could be seen in the far distance, winding like a serpent through the trees, quiet now but never still. The year was 1939, and the world stood on the cusp of another war, but in the hills of northern Nigeria, the echoes of an older battle still whispered through the dry wind. Garin Musa had grown, modestly, quietly, into a community of traders, teachers, and herbalists. The village had acquired a schoolhouse, a hand pump well, and even a British inspector who arrived once every 2 years to tick boxes and ask questions he never listened to the answers for. But beneath the surface of its slow expansion lived a pulse, an unspoken pact. Children were still taught not to bathe in the river. Crops were rotated by moon cycle, not just season. And once a year, every year, the villagers would climb the hill to pour a single gourd of river water into the dry summit well. A ritual now done without asking why. The elders remembered. Yarrow, now a man with 2 children and a bad leg from a collapsed granary wall, remembered most of all. Malam Musa had passed in 1931, buried with his Quran beneath a fig tree, his grave wrapped in white cloth, his name etched into a smooth river stone placed at its foot. Before his death, he had whispered something only to Yarrow. It wasn't a prayer, nor a warning. It was an instruction. When the water climbs again, you must walk into it. Not to fight, to listen. Yarrow had nodded then, thinking it was the final riddle of an old man sliding into death. But years later, in the dry season of 1938, strange things began to happen once more. Animals fled the lower plains. Trees, fully green, began to shed leaves. And in the middle of a cloudless week in May, a tremor split the ground at the very edge of the river bend. Not with the fury of an earthquake, but with the precision of something released. The river, long thought tamed, widened overnight. No rain fell. No upstream dam broke. Yet the water spilled into abandoned fields like a lover returning uninvited. In villages downstream from the 1919 flood, wells overflowed with brown, bitter liquid. Insects swarmed. Fish leapt from the depths and died on shore. A fever returned. Not an epidemic, but a whispering madness. People heard voices in their water jars. Children dreamt of drowning. Women miscarried twins with webbed fingers. Once again, reports were filed and dismissed. A British geologist declared it a minor tectonic shift exacerbated by colonial irrigation channels. But in Garin Musa, no one waited for officials to explain. They had seen this story before. On the night of the third flood sign, Yarrow walked to the hill alone. His children slept. His wife begged him not to go. But he carried the old clay gourd used by Musa himself, filled it with water drawn from the very edge of the swollen river, and ascended the dry hill under moonlight. There, he poured the water into the summit well, not as ritual, but as communion. Then he did what Musa had asked. He lay down, closed his eyes, and listened. He heard voices, but not human, not God's. Something older. It was not language, but rhythm. The heartbeat of sediment, the cry of stone pulled loose by water, the memory of erosion. It spoke not in words, but in grief. The river, it seemed, did not rise out of anger. It rose out of pain. Something beneath had been wounded when the idol was shattered in 1918. Not a spirit, not a being, but a boundary. A compact between land and water broken by arrogance. That pain had echoed through every channel and drop since, leaking into dreams and livestock and wombs. When Yarrow awoke, he was shivering. But the gourd was gone. In its place lay a stone, smooth, flat, warm to the touch despite the cold air. He brought it back to the village and buried it at the foot of Musa's grave. The river stopped rising the next day. They say now that Garin Musa has something rare of balance. Its people age slower, dream deeper. Visitors come and forget what they came for. The land is still dry, but it yields crops even in lean seasons. And once every 10 years, a child is born with a faint web between the toes. An old mark, a small echo, a reminder that the river, though calm, never forgets. In 1959, a British historian wrote a forgotten journal article titled, "The Mystery of the 1919 Nigerian Floods." In it, he scoffed at the locals' fetishistic rituals and the ludicrous idea that water could bear memory. The article was never published. The historian died of drowning in his own study, in a house miles from any body of water. Today, Garin Musa still stands on its hill. The well is still dry, and the river, far below, winds its ancient path like a sleeping god with one eye open, silent, watching, waiting. Let's jump to next story. Story 6. The shadowed valleys beneath the thick canopy of the Avidya forest, where the golden light of the sun rarely touched the mossy floor, the first signs of the verdant silence were ignored. Sumeru had always been a land of balance, where scholars bent their minds to unraveling the intricacies of the world and where nature and academia walked hand in hand. The academia was the heart of it all. A monolithic bastion of knowledge that reached into the skies like a prayer answered in marble and vine. It was here that the murmurs began, whispered first through the anxious lips of forest rangers, then documented with precise hesitance by junior researchers. They spoke of withered wildlife found motionless near the Lokapila jungle, their bodies green not by rot, but by an eerie bioluminescent lichen that pulsed faintly in the dark like an unnatural heartbeat. Insects avoided the corpses, and the plants surrounding them slowly curled inward, as if recoiling in disgust or fear. At first, the scholars debated it as a rare fungal anomaly, perhaps a miscalculation in environmental balance caused by a rogue experiment or a meteorological anomaly. But when humans, isolated herbalists, reclusive sages, then wandering pilgrims, began to fall silent too, the tone changed. By mid-spring, the first confirmed case was brought into the lower wards of the academia's medical division. The patient, a woman in her early 30s, had walked alone from the wild edges of Party's Dai to the city's southern entrance, barefoot and dazed. Her breath labored and her eyes a glossy green that seemed to shimmer unnaturally even in shadow. She spoke only once, a whisper lost among rustling leaves. "The forest sings when it feeds." Within an hour she collapsed. By dawn she was dead. No lesions, no fever, no external trauma. Only a slow paralysis that began at her fingers, crept upward like a climbing vine. It wasn't long before others followed. Entire villages, usually bustling with the cultivation of herbs and knowledge, went quiet. And when sentinels were dispatched to investigate, they returned bearing silence with them. Those who didn't perish en route arrived with blank expressions and the same unnatural shimmer in their eyes, as if something had plucked the string of their soul and left only an echo behind. The plague, dubbed verdant silence by the terrified scholars, wasn't just a disease. It was a presence. In the halls of the academia, panic wrestled with pride. Grand Sage Rashid, ever the pillar of reason, initially dismissed the phenomenon as psychological, mass hysteria induced by overexposure to the depths of the forest. But his voice, once booming with certainty, began to quiver when his personal assistant, Azine, failed to report to the central library. She was found 3 days later, curled up beneath a flowering Sumeru rose bush. Her notebook filled with sketches of vines wrapping around human skulls. She had written the phrase, "Roots remember everything," on every page over and over again. Rashid stopped speaking publicly after that. Behind closed doors, emergency councils were held. Unreadable scrolls were dug out from the sealed archives beneath the academia. The matras were dispatched in secret, instructed not to engage the press nor the scholars. Even the sages of the Spantamat and Emerta Dershan's rivals in methodology, but not in desperation, began collaborating feverishly, scouring alchemical recipes, long-abandoned forest records, and ancient glyphs etched into forgotten stones in the forest's heart. But Sumeru had always revered knowledge as the guiding star, and now it offered no answers. The people, meanwhile, turned inward. Markets thinned. Herbalists refused to harvest anything that grew near the eastern forest. The Marston hospitals overflowed with patients who claimed to hear whispers in their sleep, vines brushing their skin, even as their bodies remained still and pale. Panic bled into faith. Pilgrims flocked to the Tree of Dreams in a desperate plea for deliverance, leaving offerings of rare herbs and petals soaked in tears, hoping the Dendro Archon might intervene. But Nahida had been silent. Her sanctuary closed. Rumors began of her weeping, of her losing her connection to her mints or worse, of her being consumed by the same creeping silence that now threatened to erase everything. In the outer reaches, far from the control of the city, rogue factions of former scholars blamed the academia, claiming they had unearthed something forbidden, a fungal curse buried deep in the roots of her mints itself. One even accused the sages of weaponizing it to call Sumeru's dissenters. When an entire caravan of refugees from the border failed to arrive in Gannerville, the whispers turned to rage. The city locked down. The curfews were enforced. Among the growing unrest, one figure stood apart. Not a sage or soldier, but a former student named Kaveen. Once expelled for unorthodox theories about biomimetic communication in plants, Kaveen had lived in the forests for years, becoming one with the foliage, speaking in half-formed metaphors that most deemed nonsense. But now, he was the only one who seemed unfazed by the silence. He claimed to know its origin. He spoke of a buried mother root that connected every tree in Sumeru, even the ones brought into city courtyards or academic greenhouses, a consciousness older than her Minsel, wounded by centuries of harvesting and ignorance. "It remembers us," he said. "It was never a sickness. It is awakening." Most dismissed him. But as more city trees began wilting in synchronization, and the marble of the academia's inner courtyard cracked with vines no one had planted, even skeptics began to listen. Kaveen led a small expedition, volunteers and desperate researchers, into the Ovidya forest's forbidden heart. What they found was not death, but something worse, understanding. Towering roots pulsated with a green light, and beneath them lay skeletal remains entwined with roots, whispering in the voices of the dead. "Let us grow in peace," they murmured. The expedition never returned whole. One man came back, blind and mute, carving roots into every surface he could touch. Kaveen's journal was recovered days later. Half buried in soil, its last entry a scrawled confession. "We were never the gardeners. We were the weeds." The city changed after that. It wasn't a sudden collapse like those in war or storm, but a slow unraveling, like silk thread pulled loose from its own hem. Citizens no longer spoke to one another in the streets. Windows were shuttered, not against thieves, but the creeping lichen that now painted corners of alleyways in faint, glowing green. The birds had stopped singing, and even the sumpter beasts, once so reliable for travel and trade, refused to enter the city. Within the confines of the once great academia, learning gave way to superstition, and superstition was quickly devoured by fear. The Marsden Hospital sealed its doors after the final volunteer medic collapsed mid-treatment, mumbling something about vines in his veins. There were no riots, no loud proclamations, just a resignation that seeped through every crack of marble and bark. The people of Sumer were listening, and the forest, it seemed, had started speaking again. The Matras, once guardians of order and clarity, turned into shadows of their former selves. Some were reassigned to containment units, euphemisms for patrols that burned entire greenhouses suspected of infection. Others simply disappeared into the forest after prolonged exposure to infected districts. Files within the House of Dina began to vanish too. Entire decades of botanical research erased, as though the very paper had been devoured by mold. The Akasha terminals, once praised as conduits of boundless knowledge, began malfunctioning. Users reported strange dreams afterward. Visions of roots coiling around their minds, of ancient trees whispering numbers and coordinates, of the academia's own layout seen from below, as if from the soil itself. The silence was no longer physical. It had become cognitive. Philosophers dubbed it conceptual wilt. Thoughts began to blur. Equations faded mid-sentence. The most brilliant minds found themselves forgetting the names of their own research. And all across the city, petals fell in perfect synchrony, silent, green, soft as breath. Nahida remained hidden. Official statements insisted she was in deep communion with her Minsel, seeking answers beyond mortal reach. But the people had begun to murmur her name with the same trembling reverence they once reserved for the forbidden forest. Some claimed she was resisting the verdant silence with all her divine will. Others whispered that she had been the first to succumb. None dared venture to the sanctuary to confirm. Those who tried returned aimless, muttering nursery rhymes and plucking invisible flowers from the air. The sages, fractured and afraid, turned to desperation. Rituals long deemed unethical were revived. Experiments involving dendroslimes, dream enhancers, and even memory harvesting were conducted in the lowest vaults of the academia. But nothing slowed the silence. It wasn't alive in the way one could dissect or quarantine. It was a knowing, a will. Outside the city, smaller settlements adapted in stranger ways. The jungle folk of Appamwood ceased all contact with the capital and began worshipping a massive tree they claimed had grown overnight. They called it Eudaria, the mother ear, and insisted she spoke through spores and rain. Offerings of bloodroot and dream sap were made in ritual dances, performed without music, only breath. Rangers sent to observe returned covered in moss, speaking in riddles. Entire villages along the river Yavin vanished, their homes left behind, but overtaken by flowering vines that whispered in the wind. Not all succumbed with terror. Some embraced it, believing it to be penance. The scholars had long debated the sentience of plants, of forests, of Erminsel itself. Now the debate had ended. Not with proof, but with submission. Among the dwindling resistance was Parvana, a mid-rank scholar of the Amrtadarshan, unremarkable in status, untrained in combat, and largely ignored during her years of dissertation on symbiotic cognition in non-sapient flora. Yet in the chaos, her theories proved prescient. Parvana believed that Sumeru had breached a threshold centuries ago, that their manipulation of dreams and plants had cultivated a shared subconscious with the environment. She claimed the silence was not a punishment, but a realignment. The forest no longer trusted humans to guide their own path. "It thinks for us now," she wrote in a final paper, smuggled out through underground printing circles. "We do not suffer, it is pruning us." In secret, Parvana and a small network of remaining lucid scholars attempted one last measure. Not to destroy the silence, but to speak to it. They developed a dream seed engine. An arcane mechanism built of memory threads, ley line roots, and a fragment of an old Akasha terminal, all woven together to simulate a dream visible to the land itself. They dreamed of balance, of coexistence, of apology. On the eve of its activation, Parvana wrote a final journal entry. "If it sees the truth of our hearts, perhaps it will let us remain among its roots, not as masters, but as saplings." The engine pulsed once, then the lights of Sumeru went out. The dawn that followed was unlike any that had come before. The skies above the academia shimmered faintly green. Vines no longer crept, but held still, glistening like dew-covered sentinels. Citizens emerged from their homes in silence, not blank-eyed, but alert. The pressure in the air had lifted. The Akasha hummed softly once more, and the tree of dreams glowed as though cleansed. Flowers bloomed in symmetrical spirals along the city's edge. But not all had returned. Those taken by the silence, thousands of them, were not found. Their names lived only in seed blooms that now crowned every corner of the capital. And from the base of the academia, where once marble ruled, a sapling grew. Tall, serene, unmoving. A plaque was set before it, not by decree, but by collective will. It bore no names, only words. The forest remembers. We are its dream. Let's jump to next story. Story 7. In the earliest years of the 20th century, long before the Electro-Archon issued decrees of eternity, and even before Mondstadt's final, feudal chains were broken. Teyvat stood at a fragile crossroads of ambition and balance. The seven nations were not as disconnected as they would later become. Trade routes thrived across sea and land. Vision bearers wandered freely without fear of commissions or inquisition, and the skies, once punctuated by dragons, now shimmered with smoke rising from industrial furnaces. Progress, it seemed, had bloomed in a dangerous symmetry. Steamships coasted the northern fjords of Snesnea, and the vineyards of Mondstadt began exporting their wines in brass-capped bottles rather than clay. Even the alchemists of Sumeru whispered of machines that could interpret dreams and calculate probability with dendro-encoded wheels. But while advancement surged forward, so too did the silence between the stars, an ancient quiet listening. It began as a flicker, a rupture in the northern sky above a remote Snez-9 observatory. For weeks, The researchers had been logging strange auroras that did not match celestial patterns, spirals of violet and green that blinked like Morse code across the clouds. One astronomer, a young woman named Ludmila Verov, theorized the phenomenon to be celestial interference, a phrase quickly dismissed by her superiors. They would not heed her warnings, even as birds began falling from the sky with their wings scorched. The ice around the observatory cracked in perfect hexagons. On the night of her disappearance, Ludmila etched a final message on the frosted lens of the telescope. "It is not the stars that move, it is us." From that moment on, nothing was the same. The calamity came not as a roar, but as a hum. A deep vibration that stretched through the ley lines beneath Tevat, like a wound unraveling. In Liyue, miners reported entire veins of cor lapis turning to dust at the touch. In Inazuma, sacred sakura began weeping amber fluid that hissed upon contact with metal. The very essence of elemental power, it seemed, was growing unstable. Ether itself was degrading. When the skies cracked above Stormterra's lair, a column of colorless light burst downward, reaching into the core of the earth. What emerged was not an entity, but a phenomenon, a field of pure nullification. The people called it the Pale Fire. The Pale Fire was not flame. It gave no heat and cast no shadow. It consumed meaning, names, memories, even the ability to describe what it touched. Villages on the outskirts of Mondstadt disappeared, not into rubble but into blankness. Entire libraries were found with their texts intact, but every word erased. People would point to where their homes once stood and weep, unable to remember the color of their roofs or the sound of their children's laughter. Elemental users were struck first and hardest. Vision bearers found their abilities not only suppressed, but reversed. An anemo wielder causing suffocation instead of wind. A pyro wielder freezing over mid-incantation. The balance was undone. The archons, for reasons unknown, remained silent. Panic fractured the tenuous peace between nations. Fontaine, in its ever-technological pride, attempted to contain the Pale Fire with mechanical constructs and steam-driven vacuum pylons. But their machines only rusted in place, frozen mid-work, as if the disaster mocked the arrogance of human invention. Natlan's warriors tried ritual and flame, but their fires flickered and betrayed them. The Pale Fire was not a force to resist. It was a concept to be unlearned. Sumer's sages theorized that this was not an attack, but a correction. Tevat had evolved too far from the truths that shaped it. The gods of old, those unnamed and exiled, were reclaiming silence. It was around this time that rumors surfaced of a girl without a vision who walked unburned through the zones of nullification. She was seen in Liyue Harbor, touching cracked statues of Rex Lapis, and they wept tears of ink. She crossed the wastelands of central Snezhnaya, and flowers bloomed from the ash in her wake. They called her the Null Bearer. According to fragmented tales, she bore no name, no element, and no allegiance. Yet wherever she went, the Pale Fire paused, not vanished, but observing. The Fatui sought to capture her, believing her a key to either weaponizing or ending the phenomenon. But she disappeared each time, leaving only footprints and terrain that should have remembered none. In the heart of Mondstadt, a conclave formed, alchemists, exorcists, outlaws, bards, and even a few retired knights, gathering beneath the ruins of Old Mon Cathedral. There, the group began to study remnants left behind by the Null Bearer. Specifically, writings etched into clay jars and ancient bark that resisted the erasure of the Pale Fire. These glyphs spoke of a cycle of cleansing that came not from divine will, but from the laws beneath the laws. What they found terrified them. This was not the first erasure. It had happened before, far before the current archons ever rose. Civilizations that had grown too loud, too bright, too complex. They had been forgotten, consumed by the Pale Fire, and replaced by quieter ages. Tevat's current era had simply grown too loud again. By the spring of 1904, a full year after the initial auroral disturbance, Tevat had entered what would later be remembered in oral fragments as the Blanketing. Entire regions of the map lost their names. The port of Tana in Sumeru, once a thriving academic waypoint nestled between the Great Dunes and the Devantaka Mountain, was rendered so unrecognizable by the Pale Fire that even the stars above it refused to orient properly. Travelers wandered in circles as compasses spun violently, unable to point toward any pole or magnetic truth. The laws of space warped, not with chaos, but with indifference. It was not destruction, it was deletion. Across Teyvat, survivors took desperate measures. Mondstadt's Dawn Winery sealed itself behind vines of crystallized dandelion seed extract, hoping to shield its grounds from the nullification field. The Knights of Favonius, left fractured and visionless, established a final radio signal station atop Dragon's Pine, sending repeated broadcasts in the old tongue. We still remember. Please remember us. But as weeks passed, the broadcasts became less coherent. Words were replaced by hollow static, then silence. By the time the snow began to fall, even the mountains seemed to forget it had once hosted a fortress. In Liyue, a last-ditch effort was led by a coalition of adepti, alchemists, and rogue exorcists. Their goal was not to defeat the Pale Fire, but to negotiate with it. A ritual was staged atop Mount Tianhe, where stone tablets inscribed in pre-archonic glyphs were laid in concentric rings, mirroring the structure of ley lines. Offerings were made, not gold, not artifacts, but stories. The ritualists poured out ancestral memories, passed down from generation to generation, as if to say, we are not machines of power. We are vessels of history. For a moment, the pale fire stilled, hovering like fog along the mountaintop. Some said they heard voices, ancient, sorrowful, and yearning. But when the ritual concluded, only a single glyph remained visible on the central altar, glowing faintly with dendrolite. It read too late. The null bearer reappeared soon after, walking into the center of the ritual site, barefoot and expressionless. She did not speak. Instead, she placed her hand upon the glyph, and the air quivered as if time itself hiccuped. The watchers fell to their knees. One adeptus described the sensation as being stared at by the concept of forgetting. When she lifted her hand, the glyph faded, but a seed, small, black, and pulsing remained in its place. The null bearer took it and walked east, vanishing over the cliffs that bordered the sea of clouds. No one followed. Meanwhile, across the sea in Inazuma, the Raiden shogun, still bearing her original mortal shell, had long foreseen the implications of such a phenomenon. Her nation, already locked in pursuit of eternity, responded to the pale fire not with panic, but with a deadly stillness. Borders were sealed. The Grand Narukami Shrine enacted a state of spiritual lockdown, severing communication with other elemental planes. Reports from scattered refugees told of a growing void encircling the islands, one that bent even the stars out of position. Some claimed that the Electro-Archon had split her consciousness, hiding fragments in the minds of her most devout retainers, shielding her essence from deletion. Others whispered darker theories, that she had welcomed the Pale Fire as a validation of her eternal doctrine, and that Inazuma would soon be erased not by force, but by consent. But the most devastating effect of the Pale Fire was not on land or law, it was on memory. Elder scholars in Sumeru began forgetting entire fields of knowledge. Elemental theory texts turned blank overnight. Children awoke without names. The renowned astrologist Kyla of Fontaine, once able to chart destinies across bloodlines, lost the ability to read even the simplest signs. She was found wandering the streets of Port Ormuz, whispering a single question to everyone she met. "Have I already forgotten you?" She died clutching a book with no title and pages that resisted ink. And yet, in this expanding absence, a strange form of resistance emerged. In a pocket village near Gondorville, one of the few not consumed, storytellers gathered around campfires and shared tales from memory. No scrolls, no inscriptions, no written record. Just voice, repetition, and ritual. Songs were sung not to preserve music, but to anchor people in place. Names became spells. Every individual was expected to tell their story nightly, to multiple others, so that no life could vanish unremembered. It was here that the Null Bearer appeared again, this time not to walk through silence, but to listen. She sat among the children and nodded as they chanted family histories and invented new myths on the spot. One tale claimed she was not a person at all, but the manifestation of Teyvat's forgotten goddess, a divine being not of war, wind, or wealth, but of memory itself. Not a wielder of power, but a guardian of persistence. The theory gained ground among surviving philosophers. Perhaps the Null Bearer was the Pale Fire's antithesis. Not flame against flame, but presence against oblivion. A reminder that what is remembered cannot be erased. The final known record of her came from a wandering playwright in Natlon, whose traveling troupe wandered too far into a nullified zone. Only the playwright returned, incoherent and trembling. He held a charred scroll, the last line of which read, "She walked into the fire and it paused, not in defeat, but in reverence." No one knows what happened after that. In time, the pale fire receded, not vanished, but dormant, like a god resting after judgment. The skies over Tevat regained their color, though stars now twinkled out of rhythm. The ley lines stabilized. Vision bearers regained partial access to their abilities. But scars remained. Large swaths of the land were left blank. White plains where no echo returned and no shadow fell. Maps were redrawn, history rewritten, and many names were lost forever. A statue stands in central Sumeru today. A woman with no face, no inscription, and no offered element. Children still sing stories around it. They say that so long as one story remains, she still listens. Let's jump to next story. Story 8. In the year 1904, Renacida was a land still reborn from the wars of the last century. A city-state ringed by towering mountains of ash-colored stone and veined with glowing rivers drawn from deep thermal wells. Long before people dared call it home, the land had trembled with fire and steam, shaped by ancient volcanic veins buried under thick jungle and cracked basalt. But time had softened its threat, or so people thought. By 1904, Renacida thrived. Glass domes caught sunlight atop parliament towers and electric railways hummed through the metallic veins of its lower quarters. Market plazas sang with the voices of poets and inventors. Children ran barefoot across the obsidian steps of the academia's courtyards. Progress had cloaked the city in confidence, and none looked toward the horizon with fear anymore. But beneath its foundations, a sleeping thing began to stir. The disaster did not start with fire or storm. It began with silence. Deep in the mines beneath the western quarter, where molten residue was siphoned to power the northern grid, a low vibration started to echo. So low it could not be heard, only felt in the teeth and the bones of the workers. They called it the pulse. First it was just a whisper, a harmless hum that shivered across the steel walls of the conduit tunnels. Then tools began to break. Picks snapped mid-swing. Welders misfired in sudden sparks. One man, Matteo Valtri, began muttering about a voice under the stone. By the third week, 6 workers had fled the mine completely, leaving their wages behind. Officials sealed their testimonies, and Renacida's papers printed nothing. Above ground, the city moved on as if untouched. Engineers perfected the energy transfer towers. The Chancellor of Sciences announced a new collaboration between the Institute and the outer settlements. Children chased glowing insects in the bioluminescent gardens of the East Atrium. Yet something wrong was spreading beneath their feet. The animals knew first. The alpine drakes that usually roamed the cliffs vanished. Birds circled and circled, but would not land. Elder shepherds spoke of ancient omens, of the breathless, the time when the sky would hold its breath and the stone would scream. Most dismissed them as relics of a superstitious past. Then came the first rupture. On the morning of April 17th, without warning, a fracture erupted through the western district. The streets split like fabric under pressure, spewing not magma, but a black mist that shimmered with unnatural energy. People screamed as the mist spread in seconds, moving with intent like a living thing. Those who inhaled it collapsed, eyes wide open, pupils faded to white. They didn't die, at least not right away. Their skin paled, and they wandered as if sleepwalking, murmuring in languages no one could understand. Scholars called it the gray fever. Clerics called it judgment. The city just called it terror. The Chancellor issued an emergency decree. Evacuation orders spread across the western zone. Elite guards in insulated suits tried to cordon off the infected mist, but containment proved impossible. The mist was not static. It moved through cracks, tunnels, and even the gaps between walls. It knew where to go. Within a week, over 4,000 had fallen ill. The lower railways stopped. Street lights flickered unnaturally. Electrical surges danced across the power grid, triggered by pulses from deep underground. At night, the survivors reported a rhythmic thumping from below. like a massive heartbeat syncing with the city's failing power. In desperation, the government deployed what they called the Hephaestus Protocol. Ancient emergency blueprints, drawn from scrolls older than Renaissida itself, dictated that the thermal veins must be collapsed. Bombs were planted across key tunnels meant to seal the core and choke the energy flow feeding the mist. But the city had grown too much fast. Networks of power, data, water, and waste were all tangled together in a delicate lattice. To collapse one vein was to cripple 10 systems. Still, the Chancellor approved it. The detonation was scheduled for the night of May 2nd. Trains were packed. Families wept along the bridges. The mist, by then, had reached the base of the Hall of Archives. From within its black swirl, strange lights blinked, like stars submerged in smoke. Historians insisted they resembled sigils from Old World scripts, etched not on paper, but carved in air. The city's philosophers, once spoke only of knowledge and reason, fell silent. At exactly 2247, the tunnels were collapsed. For a moment it worked. The mist shuddered, shrank, and coiled in on itself like a wounded creature. The air cleared. People emerged blinking, mouths open in disbelief. A cheer even broke out in the grand square. But then came the echo. The detonation had triggered something deeper, something older. A roar unlike anything human ears had catalogued before split the city in two. Buildings crumpled not from the blast, but from the scream that followed, a vibration that turned steel to ribbons and melted glass in its frames. The skies above Renaissida turned copper red. The mountain ranges to the west glowed along their peaks as though ignited from within. From the deepest point in the crater, a column of that black mist surged once more, larger, faster, and now crawling with luminescent veins of crimson. The pulse had become a scream. In the aftermath of the scream, Renaissida was no longer a city. It had become a wound carved into the surface of the world. The grand square, once filled with crystal sculpture and lectures of science and enlightenment, now lay torn apart by fissures that spat vapor and light like angry spirits. What few street lamps remained upright flickered erratically, casting fractured shadows on shattered marble. Even time seemed broken. For survivors wandering the upper terraces, minutes stretched into hours, and the stars above moved too slowly, as if hesitant to witness what remained. The mist had grown teeth. In its re-emergence, it moved with impossible fluidity, slipping up walls, between breaths, through cracks no wider than a needle's eye. Those caught in it did not always fall unconscious anymore. Some simply stopped speaking, froze mid-motion, and remained standing like forgotten statues, untouched by decay, locked in a trance of quiet madness. Some began walking toward the mountain's heart. The government collapsed in less than a day. With the Chancellor lost in the explosion and the High Circle in hiding, or dead, the last orders came from the night scribes, those keepers of Renassida's oldest records. They had once been archivists, monks with ink-stained hands and quiet voices. Now they led caravans of evacuees, guiding them through ancient catacombs that predated even the city's founding. Maps carved into bone, passages etched into ceiling domes. The people followed without question. The roads above had become impassable, twisted by the quake, or shrouded in vapor, or claimed by the tremors that continued at intervals like the heartbeat of something not yet finished. It was beneath the city where a final escape might be found. Story 9. In the remote northern region of Lernia, nestled between frost-bitten cliffs and glacial valleys untouched by modern maps, the name Frolova was whispered like a sacred warning. It wasn't a village on any government record, nor a ruin acknowledged by scholars of ancient civilization. It was a presence, part legend, part scar, said to be the remains of an empire that never should have existed. In 1902, a young ethnographer named Clement Dravin set out to investigate it, armed with a few mentions in a banned Russian manuscript and an obsession that had taken root after a half-mad Romanian linguist muttered the word Frolova before vanishing into the Carpathians. Dravin believed that somewhere past the edge of cartography, beyond any rational topography, Frolova endured, not as a ghost town, but as something living in time's blind spots, sustained by the unspeakable rituals of its founders. Dravin's journey north took him from Marseille to St. Petersburg, then farther by foot and sled into the unsanctioned wilderness beyond Arkhangelsk. Accompanied only by a local tracker named Yelka, who was promised triple pay but refused to speak of Frolova unless drunk and angry, The trek unfolded under skies that grew ever paler and more distorted. Compass needles quivered even when laid flat, matches sparked green instead of red, and every morning they found their footprints rearranged in ritualistic spirals. On the 12th day, they came upon an ancient road hewn from basalt slabs, slick with frozen moss and scribed with glyphs that pulsed faintly in the twilight. "This is her road," Yelka murmured, using the feminine pronoun with reverence and fear. "Once we step on it, she knows we're here." They walked for hours without speaking. At some point the trees changed, no longer birch or pine, but an unclassifiable species with bark like charred silk and leaves that twitched without wind. Their scent was intoxicating, a blend of lavender and rotting fruit, and Draven found himself stumbling, struck with half-dreams of fire and singing teeth. When they reached the plateau, the forest parted to reveal Frolova, a spiral of obsidian spires, seemingly melted into shape, encircling a sinkhole that shimmered with opalescent mist. There were no birds, no insects, only the hum of the ground and the breathless pressure of being watched by something very old. Yelka refused to go farther, setting up camp just before the boundary stone, an altar carved with a woman's face whose eyes bled rust. Draven crossed it alone, journal-clutched boots echoing on polished stone that had not seen footprints in decades, or perhaps centuries. As he entered the outermost ring of the city, he was struck not by decay, but by the sensation of waiting. Frolova was not abandoned. It was dormant. The walls of the towers bore no doors or windows, but the shadows between their cracks suggested movement inside. At the center of the spiral, before the misty abyss, stood a single monolith. A stone pillar wrapped in chains that bore the same glyphs as the road. At its base, bones had been arranged in complex symbols. Some were animal, some were not. Draven documented everything feverishly. He sketched the symbols, described the scent of the air, even took samples of the black moss that clung to the walls and emitted low murmurs of touch. At dusk, he returned to camp to find Yelka missing. The tracker's boots, coat, and rifle were there, neatly folded beside a trail of bloody footprints leading back into the city. Against his own dread, Draven followed them, drawn by an unnatural compulsion. He reached the monolith again, and there, upon its chained base, lay Yelka's heart, still beating, suspended in a glass vessel that hadn't been there before. What came next was a collapse of time, or memory, or identity. Draven wrote of nights that bled into days without sunrise, of statues that moved when unseen, of a voice that began speaking to him in the language of dreams. It called itself Ehl Frol, the one who broods beneath. It claimed to be the patron of the city, and the source of its eternal slumber. Draven, it said, had been chosen to be the next anchor. Every century, a mortal must remain in Frolova to ensure the world outside forgets its shape. Without this sacrifice, the city would rise again, not as a place, but as a mind that consumes other minds. He resisted at first, burned his journals, tried to flee. But each time he crossed the boundary stone, he found himself waking back at the center of the spiral, his boots dry and his hair laced with frost. Eventually he surrendered. He stopped counting days. He stopped speaking aloud. He simply watched the city sleep and listened to Ehl Frol sing its wordless lullaby beneath the soil. In 1952, half a century later, a Soviet expedition searching for uranium deposits in the north stumbled upon a region that did not appear on any map. Their Geiger counters failed. Their radio signals warped into rhythmic chanting. Several soldiers deserted within the first week. The commanding officer, Captain Maxim Blasso, recorded the following entry before sealing it in a lead box and burying it under a cairn of ironwood branches. "We have reached the place of spirals. No one will speak of it directly, but we all feel it. The men's eyes bleed when they dream. At the center of the fog is a tower that hums when approached. I saw a man with a European face watching us from its base. He did not blink. He was not alive. But I think he was waiting for me to see him." Decades passed. Frolova faded again into myth. Only a few fragments of Draven's writings survived. Scraps recovered by black market artifact dealers in Helsinki, or in occultist gatherings in Bucharest. The story said the city existed beneath the folds of time, and that once every 100 years, its heart would slow unless fed a dreamer of flesh and mind. In 1999, a small group of scholars attempted to retrace Draven's only one returned, hair bleached white, eyes sealed shut with melted wax, whispering in a language never heard before or since. He kept repeating one phrase: "She dreams beneath the stone. She dreams of waking." In modern circles of the esoteric and the arcane, Falova has become synonymous with cursed knowledge. To write its name is to risk drawing its gaze. Some claim the city moves between the folds of continents, shifting like a parasite in the skin of Earth. Others believe it is not a city at all, but a concept too large to be contained in flesh. A metaphysical wound that only appears as towers and spirals because the human brain cannot perceive its real form. Whatever the case, those who seek Falova do so at their own peril. The cost is not death, but transformation. A slow, inevitable reconfiguration into something no longer bound by breath or reason. Somewhere beyond ice and logic, Clement Draven still waits at the edge of the monolith. Not alive, not quite dead, bound by glyphs of rust and dream. He guards the silence of Falova, listening to the beat of her heart deep in the earth. The city sleeps, but not forever. She is hungry and time is short. Let's jump to next story. Story 10. It began not with an explosion, but with a quiet absence. An imperceptible stillness that crept over the world like a shadow that had forgotten its source. At first, there was no panic, no alarms. Just the vague realization among scattered scientists and weather stations that something had gone silent in the upper atmosphere. Birds flew in uneven circles. Satellites flickered with unexplained distortions. The tide slowed by a fraction of a second. Then the night sky shifted. Stars that had always belonged to fixed constellations suddenly twisted out of place, like a great, invisible hand had dragged the heavens across an unseen veil. Astronomers called it a gravitational anomaly. Mathematicians whispered of errors in the constants. And those who studied the dark spaces between galaxies, people already half-mad from trying to describe the indescribable, simply packed their research into sealed vaults and vanished. But still, most of the world slept soundly, unaware that the very structure of reality had begun to crack like ice under slow pressure. Then the tremors came, not earthquakes in the traditional sense, but pulses through the earth that bent metal and rewrote fault lines in real time. One morning, an entire province in western Mongolia folded into itself like paper, vanishing into a depression 2 kilometers wide and hundreds deep. Surveillance drones sent down to investigate returned only with static and a low, humming frequency that caused migraines and hallucinations in everyone who heard it. That same week, the oceans began to retract as if preparing for something immense. Tides no longer followed the moon. Fishermen in Chile reported sea creatures dying in synchronized patterns. Corals wept black ichor, and near Madagascar, a new island emerged overnight, slick, obsidian and warm to the touch, despite no volcanic activity. No one could explain the perfectly geometric indentations on its surface. No one could enter its boundaries and return the same. It was not until the skies changed color that humanity collectively understood it was no longer in command. The blue faded into a copper hue, and clouds began to move in strange lattices, ignoring wind patterns and forming spirals of impossible precision. Lightning struck upward. Rain became hot and metallic. Plants began to move in slow, defensive gestures. Leaves curling before people approached, roots retracting from the soil, trees leaning away from cities. Cities themselves, especially the older ones, Rome, Kyoto, Cairo, began experiencing what the press euphemistically called spatial distortions. Streets looped into themselves. Time inside subway tunnels slowed by minutes. Reflections in windows no longer matched their sources. And worst of all, no signal could be transmitted for longer than 7 minutes without degrading into what one researcher described as syntax that speaks back. The United Nations convened in a last-ditch effort to unify what remained of the global order. But trust had eroded too quickly. Borders closed. Satellites fell. Major capitals went dark without warning. In the third week of the cataclysm, as people came to call it, not because it was precise, but because no language could define it, entire nations ceased to answer calls. Not because they were destroyed in explosions or floods, but because they were no longer reachable, as if moved elsewhere. The ground beneath Europe began to hum. Fissures opened across continents, not like faults, but as straight lines with sharp angles that radiated light when viewed from the upper stratosphere. Religious leaders declared the end time. Scientists warned of multidimensional collapse. The common people only knew that when the sun set, it did not return in the same place. And yet, amidst this unfolding, something deeper began to stir. Not a second disaster, but a kind of awakening. Survivors in the northern steppes reported hearing voices beneath the frost, speaking in languages they could not name but still understood. In Tibet, monks began to chant day and night, not from fear but from recognition. The weaving has begun. One wrote in a note found hours after his monastery folded into the clouds. People in Kenya spoke of dreams filled with colossal silhouettes pacing behind the stars. Children in Peru began drawing diagrams of celestial mechanics no adult could explain. It was not simply a cataclysm, they said. It was the return of something older than form, an ancient recursion reasserting itself upon the fabric of a false world. Governments tried to fight it. Nuclear warheads were deployed toward the core anomaly, in the Arctic Circle. But when the missiles detonated, the sky fractured instead of the ground. For one full hour, the Earth saw itself in reflection. Millions of alternate planets superimposed across the sky, each slightly different, each screaming in silence. In one, the oceans were made of fire. In another, a great serpentine form coiled around the globe like a belt. In a third, Earth was covered entirely in black eyes that blinked as one. After that hour, the fractures closed. The sun reset. But the damage was done. By the fourth month, humanity was no longer united in its fear but scattered in its myths. The old governments had vanished or transformed into autocratic theocracies that worshipped the anomalies as gods. In what remained of Australia, survivors gathered around vast rings of crystal that erupted from the earth-like teeth. These shard fields, as they were called, whispered prophecies to those who touched them. Some died instantly. Others wandered into the sea, never to return. But a few came back changed, their veins glowing with silver and their eyes filled with maps of the void. These were called the Marked, and many began to lead cults, some benevolent, others brutal, claiming they had been chosen as stewards of the new weave. Cities continued to dissolve, not in flame or flood, but in irrelevance. Streets led to nowhere. Electronics refused to work for longer than moments. Writing disappeared from paper. Even memory grew treacherous. People forgetting their own names, their own languages, speaking only in metaphors and colors. But in the ruins, small enclaves persisted, groups that rejected both science and mysticism. They lived in silence, ate from greenhouses shielded by lead, and communicated only through gesture and music. They believed that by rejecting language, they could avoid being rewritten. Some called them mad. Others envied their clarity. None who left their ranks ever returned unchanged. In the final days of the second spiral, a term carved into the walls of the ruins of Oslo, date unknown, a great chasm opened in the Indian Ocean, not naturally but with geometric precision. From it rose a structure not made of matter but of vibration and light, a tower of pure resonance that sang constantly in 11 tones, one for each major fault line on the planet. Its song caused no pain, only dreams. Anyone within its field of sound began to remember lives they had never lived. As insects, stars, gods, machines. Some wept, others laughed until they collapsed. A few ascended, levitated into the tower's higher layers, and were never seen again. The tower remains to this day unspeaking, its song now shifting into new harmonies that no earthborn scale can measure. By then the world had split, not into continents, but into frequencies, layers of reality overlapping one another. Some places became portals to higher or lower harmonics of existence. A man might leave his house and enter a field where time flowed backward. A woman might walk into a forest and emerge in a version of her childhood she had never lived. Language was no longer sufficient. Physics had retired. Myth had returned not as story, but as structure. The very laws of reality were undone, and in their place came the loom, a vast, invisible architecture of choices, memories, and energies that wrapped around the world like a cocoon of infinite possible rebirth. No final disaster ever came. The world did not end. It unraveled, and in that unraveling, something deeper was revealed. Beneath the machinery of civilization, beneath the ego of humanity, lay a truth older than time. That all worlds are borrowed, all lives are echoes, and all cataclysms are invitations. In the silence that followed, the stars resumed their ancient positions. The earth, though changed, continued to spin, and somewhere, in the shell of what was once Paris, a child born without eyes looked into the sky and smiled, as if recognizing something just returned. And so it was that the cataclysm, feared as the end of all things, became the revelation of their beginning. From the ashes of collapsed logic and the ruins of history's certainties rose a world no longer bound by linear time, fixed memory, or singular truth. What survived was not civilization as it had been, but something far more fluid. An ever-shifting song of lives and worlds learning to coexist within the melody of the loom. In this new cadence of reality, where stars hum softly to the bones of the earth and dreams carved pathways through waking thought, humanity did not vanish. It became myth, it became motion, it became many. And in the stillness between beats of the new world's heart, if one listened closely enough, one might still hear the echo of a voice, not in fear, not in warning, but in awe whispering. This was not the end. This was the remembering.